Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to call to order the May 4th special study session of the Palm Springs City Council. The first order of business is the Pledge of Allegiance. I invite those who can to stand with me. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Madam Clerk, roll call, please.
Councilmember Holstedge.
Here.
Councilmember Coors.
Here.
Councilmember Woods. Present. Mayor Pro Tem Garner.
Here.
Mayor Middleton.
Present.
All members are present.
City Attorney, report on closed session, please.
Yes, Honorable Mayor, members of the City Council, and members of the public. The City Council met in closed session earlier this afternoon to discuss the items that are listed on the agenda, and there was no reportable action.
Okay. Next item is public comment. I'd like to remind everyone that we have only one agenda item on this evening's agenda, and that's a discussion of the 5-year capital improvement program for fiscal years 2023 through 2027, and a review of the airport fund ending fiscal year 2021-22, and a preliminary overview of the fiscal year 2022-23 airport budget recommendation. Do we have any public comment?
David Feltman.
Members of the council, city staff, thank you. I recognize that this is a study session and that you're in the preliminary process of reviewing the budget, so my comments are not meant as commenting on kind of what you should do as the outcome or come to an outcome tonight based on this comment. But I read the staff report and parts of the CIP. It's a very long document. I actually read the prior version end to end, but this new one, the updated one, I haven't read completely, but I did see some numbers related to pickleball in there. And I just want to say, I think the paradigm that's in there is correct. And it's a really important step forward. There was some money in there proposed. I know it's not definitive, nothing is definitive, but for design. And I think that means studying what we might want as a facility, looking at other models, looking at what our community needs, both for residents and for tourism. There's some great models out there in Arizona, as our city manager I'm sure knows, and in Utah, St. George and Mesa, Arizona. And then there was some money in out years for potentially for building some of those facilities. And I know the pickleball people, myself and others have been persistent, but we are prepared to be patient. And that patience means doing the kind of due diligence that would be enabled by the council supporting that initial investment in design, so we could really come to a facility that we can all be proud of and that will bring the best outcome that is possible to the community when it's ready to be built. So I think the paradigm that's in there, or the structure and the potential outlays, are a really nice start, and I think it's fair to say we appreciate it. Thank you.
I have no registered speakers.
Okay, thank you. With that, Mr. City Attorney, or excuse me, City Manager.
Thank you very much, Mayor, Mayor Pro Tem, and Council. This is our second study session. The first one was dedicated entirely to the general fund, the city's primary operating fund, where all of the standard services are provided, police, fire, etc. Tonight, we're going to focus in on our airport and our capital improvements plan, two other significant components of the budget. The airport is an enterprise fund, so that functions differently than our general fund, which is considered a governmental fund. All that really means is that it functions like a business. It's kind of a self-contained entity that has various revenue sources and expenses and generally balances its own budget and relies on the rest of city government to provide some of its support services, so HR, finance, et cetera, et cetera. The capital fund, a little different. That's really our primary fund for funding major assets, where we would take on building libraries and parks and numerous other community facilities, as well as potentially standard governmental buildings and those kinds of things. So our staff report and the agenda put them in the order of capital improvements first and the airport second. We'd like to reverse that, while, at least for presentation purposes. While the airport is not necessarily a simple program to understand, I think it might generate a little less discussion because it is really, driven more by necessity, whereas the capital improvements plan is much more wide open in terms of what directions we may go. So if it pleases the mayor and council, we'll start with a presentation on the airport, and after that, we'll move on to the capital improvements fund. Okay. With that, I'd like to call up Harry Barrett, our Director of Aviation, to start the presentation on our airport fund.
Good evening, Madam Mayor and council members. I am going to turn this over to Victoria Carpenter in a second, who is our business manager for the airport, and she's going to walk through the slides. But I wanted to set the context for what we're asking for this evening. The airport is seeking approval for a $1.6 million increase in operating expenses to support the hiring of 12.5 additional FTEs, largely for our maintenance, planning, and security divisions. In addition, we're seeking an approval of $4.6 million for scheduled capital projects, and those projects include a common use system, which would help facilitate some flexibility at our gates for the airlines. That would also involve some kind of construction throughout the terminals, which would be removing some of our customer service counters, as well as installing new carpet in both of the terminals. $2.1 million for restroom renovations, $350,000 for airfield safety improvements, $250,000 for capital equipment purchases, and then unscheduled capital of $200,000. The history is that year over year, we've pretty much been growing consistently at the airport. We tracked it from our 2019 last fiscal year to the current fiscal year, and there's been a 20% increase in scheduled seats for all the airlines. In 2021, we saw 82% of our 2019 passenger numbers. The last part of the calendar year was most critical for us because that's where we actually saw passenger numbers in excess of 15-20% month over month. And in addition to that, we've got changing regulations, both from the FAA and TSA, as well as some pretty heavy capital needs. So last study session, the council had questions about capital specifically. The airport is required to confer with the airlines about our capital program. They have to approve the program. So we met with them a few weeks ago, and they have approved that program. Under our current agreement, for our operating costs, the airlines are required to cover any shortfall in the operating budget for the airport. In return, the airlines have a majority and interest clause where they approve anything over $300,000 in spending. So our intent is to focus on building the organization so that we have the capacity to address the capital needs that we have coming over the next 5 to 10 years. And with that, I'll turn it over to Victoria, and she can do a deep dive into the budget.
Thank you, Mr. Barrett. Good evening, Madam Mayor and members of the City Council. My name is Victoria Carpenter. I'm the Airport Administration Manager for the Palm Springs International Airport. I'll be reviewing the proposed fiscal year 2022-23 budget. Okay. All right, so the airport revenue growth is driven mainly by the increased passenger traffic. So as you'll see on the slides here, our estimated, I'm sorry, I can't see that, it's too far away. Our estimated revenue for the fiscal year 2021-22 is estimated to be at $29 million. We are proposing to use about 1.4 million of grant revenue that we received from the CARES Act. Our proposed budget for fiscal year '23 is 41 million. Of that 41 million, 12 million is proposed to be used out of grant funding. Most of our revenues are derived from our rental car transactions, our customer parking, our airline fees, and terminal concession fees. Our passenger growth is estimated to be at 3% of the estimated 21-22 year, but let me repeat that, excuse me. So the estimated passenger growth for fiscal year 22-23 is estimated to be at 2.7 million. This is a conservative passenger growth for us. We just kind of got out of COVID, and we just want to make sure that we are not over projecting for our passenger traffic. So we're going to keep that at 3% for the upcoming year. Our airport expenditures and capital projects, as Mr. Barrett said, we are doing some increases in our capital expenditures. When comparing to the estimated 21-22, we are expecting an increase of 2.4 million, and that's primarily due to facility demands. Fiscal year '23 expenditures increased by about 5.9 million due to increased passenger traffic and operating expenses. The airport maintained good cost control in fiscal year '22 by keeping our rates and fees consistent to prior year. Fiscal year '22 and '23, the airport anticipates to include additional positions to help support the growing passenger demand, which will increase personnel expenses. Harry mentioned that we were going to be doing some bathroom capacity renovations. We also are going to do some carpet replacements in the terminals, or the Bono and the RJ concourse. We're also going to be converting to common use and doing some gate paving. Our expenditures are expected to be at 33.8 million. And our capital projects are about 4.6 million. This slide shows the airport fund balance. The primary focus is going to be on the proposed budget for fiscal year '22-23. Our unassigned fund balance is projected to be at 14 million. When comparing to the estimated actual for '21-22, we're going to be ending the year at 7.6 million. The airport also has 3 other funds. The Customer Facility Charge Fund, which is entirely generated by rental car fees to finance a future rental car on consolidated rental car facility. The Passenger Facility Charge Fund, Fund 410, is charges that are levied on airline tickets to fund FAA-approved airport capital projects. And then Fund 416 is the Airport Capital Projects Fund, and that's primarily to fund airport's various capital projects. This slide here, slide 8, shows the projected unassigned fund balance of the 14 million at the end of 22-23, and has 14 airport positions that we are proposing. I'm just going to briefly go over the different positions for the airport, just to give you a general idea of what we are requesting. We are requesting 3 maintenance workers. This is primarily to help with the facility hygiene at the airport. Also, an aviation security supervisor, which is going to assist with scheduling at the badging office, administering training to the airport badge population, and a liaison with TSA. We're requesting an airport manager, airport safety management systems manager. That is going to help satisfy the implementation of a Federal Aviation Administration order, which is expected to be effective Q3 of this calendar year. Also, an aviation planner, which is going to help us with our long-range capital needs of the airport. An airport industrial technician lead, which is going to help coordinate all resources like scheduling, logs, and add personnel capacity for the maintenance of the airport baggage handling system and the passenger boarding bridge systems. A marketing and communication specialist that's going to assist with social media, community outreach, customer service, copywriting, brand management, airport advertising, and managing the airport's volunteer navigator program. A community and legislative affairs specialist. They're going to be responsible for managing and coordinating governmental affairs for the airport. An airport operations specialist to address increased demand on airport operations. A maintenance supervisor. Currently, we have 3 maintenance supervisors, and the addition of another maintenance supervisor is going to have the ability to staff 2 shifts 7 days a week. So we would have a supervisor on staff 7 days a week. And lastly, we're requesting to reclassify 4 of the airport operations supervisors from an existing step 50 to a step 52. Ultimately, for fiscal year 23, the fund balance will be a $12.4 million fund balance. That concludes my presentation. Do y'all have any questions?
Are there questions for Victoria?
Okay. Thank
I
you for
have
your
one.
time. Oh, go ahead.
Victoria, the passengers that you're projecting at 2.7 million for next year, how conservative is that estimate, and how concerned are you that as we start to rebound from the COVID closures, that we're going to see a growth rate higher than 3%?
I think we are on track for that, a higher growth rate than 3%. It is very conservative. The great thing about the airport is that we have grants that can help us get through the next, in this case, 2 years. I do not think that we are going to go lower than what we're seeing for this estimated fiscal year. So the 3% is very conservative, but it could be even higher than that.
And Victoria, might be helpful, I think when we project passengers from the standpoint of the budget, it's one thing, but when we are looking at operational issues and planning for those operational issues, we're making other assumptions. So both can be conservative, right? You might estimate less passenger growth for budgetary purposes, but when we look at the operations side and getting ready for systems and the things we might need to do, we're scenario planning for more robust growth so that we're prepared. So if that's the concern, we're certainly not relying on the budget estimates to dictate what we need to do operationally.
That is the concern, that with some of the potential for growth and some of the need that we have already identified, that we may need a more robust plan to be able to meet the demands that the public's going to bring to us. And I don't want to get into the weeds with, do we need this or do we need that, but our airport is incredibly successful, as we know.
Thank you. Okay, thank you so much.
I have a question if I can, Madam Mayor.
Yes, please.
Hi.
Thank you. I have a question about capital improvement projects for the airport. So you just referenced them. Is this the right time to ask about them, or should I wait into the larger discussion? I don't know if that's a question for the city manager or the mayor, since I'm not sure how this will be facilitated.
This is a great time for any and all questions.
Great, thank you. Could you just tell me about the ongoing work for capital improvement projects with the airport and how those were selected and what's in the hopper coming forward? My thinking is that our airport is so popular, our brand is so exciting as a destination, and we're just seeing such growth. And I'm questioning how much to invest in our airport now to really, address the ongoing maintenance issues and sort of the lack of investment which we've made over the last few years, and how to, also grow and make sure that it's, the type of airport that our visitors and residents expect. So could you just talk a little bit about that?
I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Barrett. Give me one moment.
Thank you.
Thank you for the question, Councilmember Holstage. So when we were projecting for the last 2 years what projects to assume, we were really looking at the instability of the aviation industry based on what was happening with COVID-19. Focusing on this year, we've decided to keep it conservative just because we really didn't know where the industry was headed, specific to the issues with the increases in fuel prices, with inflation. A large part of our traffic comes from Canada. The Canadian airports are debt laden. So we're really concerned about what that looks like going into the next few years and how aggressive we should be with regard to our capital program. Also, in our discussions with the Federal Aviation Administration, their concern was that we really need to focus on safety improvements to the airfield itself. And that's what they were willing to fund, the safety issues over capacity or customer experience issues. So in our analysis, we tried to focus on those, sprinkling in a little bit of the customer experience issues, and that's how we got to the restroom improvements and things like common use. Looking out a little bit further, we do anticipate some pretty aggressive planning with regard to capacity issues and dealing with those concerns.
Thank you. I really appreciate the investments now, and I appreciate the carpet is so needed, and the restroom improvements will just really upgrade the experience. So I really appreciate that. And so do you think that there's funding and capacity to do additional capital improvement projects at this time, or is sort of that what we were, approved for, at least by the FAA for that portion of the funding, when you're thinking through how aggressive to be and how much to keep in reserves?
Yes, as Justin mentioned, we do have additional funding to take on more projects as the year progresses and as we see things happen. And we are, frankly, planning for that now. We may be coming back to the council at some point later in the year to ask for additional approvals for various projects.
Thank you. That's helpful. And I'm just one person on council out of 5, but and it's hard to do this budgeting to predict the future in such uncertain times. But I definitely at least think that this is the time to invest in our airport, since we are getting so many new travelers, and we could make it a really beautiful airport when we have additional funding to use. And I'd love to, keep those customers and grow that base. I think I saw in the staff report, I just have one more question for you, but I can't find it in the staff report right now, about ARPA funding or other relief funding going to backfill payroll and other staffing costs. Is that right?
That's correct. So we had, I think, 3 or 4 grants awarded to the airport with various conditions to them, and we're using some of those to offset some of our operational costs with payroll.
And were there other uses that were considered for those funds?
To pay down debt. That was the other use. We really didn't have a lot of flexibility just given our agreement with the airlines right now, so we're focusing on operational costs and paying down debt.
Thank you. And then is it listed, I'm sorry, there's 123 pages in the capital improvement plan here, so I do want to make sure I have the right page, but is there a list of the additional projects, capital improvement projects for the airport that would be next in line if the city did decide to take a more aggressive position in investing in the airport?
We didn't include that in this staff report, but we can provide that to you.
I think that would be really helpful to see as council decides, how, I think that's a broader conversation for our budget, for the policy decision for council to make with your expertise is, how much to keep in reserves and how much to deploy to our facilities or to our community. So I would be interested in that conversation and that information. Thank you.
Any other questions or comments for Mr. Barrett? We're very pleased with the progress that we're seeing and the growth that's occurring in the airport. I think one of the big issues before us is making sure that we're staying on top of our growth and our capacity to ensure that the customer experience at our airport is better than our passengers are going to find at any other airport. Today, that's not quite the case when it comes to restroom facilities and some other things that we need to step up our game, and it looks like that's a direction that you're heading.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I don't think we're set for taking action items in a study session.
That's correct. At this point, it's just direction, although this is the time if council was inclined to seek particular changes or additional analysis. We'll talk a little bit at the end of our conversation today about what follow-up looks like and how much time we have or will need, and whether that will be an additional study session or upcoming regular sessions. But this is the primary presentation of the basic information. So if there is direction to bring back anything additional or changes, this is a good time to identify that.
I don't want to speak for everyone, but I didn't hear anything other than a number of questions to make sure we're heading in the right direction.
I think I could, if I could add. I'm so sorry, Dennis, Councilmember Woods, I didn't see you there. Hard to see you from the Zoom room. I would ask council if there is a consensus or majority who would like to see sort of analysis about what is the appropriate amount of reserves, and if there's any other capital improvement projects that would be possibly funded or considered at this time.
And if I could, just in light of that conversation, I might add that the airport is unique in functioning as an enterprise, so it's generally self-contained and self-leveling to some extent. Our master lease agreements with airlines dictate somewhat the terms of how we plan, but more or less, if we have needs, they're funded and it's balanced on the fees that airlines pay. So we are able to have that conversation, but it's not quite as open-ended as it would be if we were talking about discretionary resources in our general fund or some of our capital funds. We're also going to have a broader conversation about capital funding and capacity next, which might help illuminate our ability to invest anywhere across the spectrum of possible capital improvements. We do have opportunities to prioritize, but generally speaking, the same staff would oversee airport improvements that would oversee parks and facilities and other kinds of improvements. So we're also balancing there on kind of where we put emphasis. So it might be helpful to have some of that conversation and then give overall direction on shifting emphasis, whether that's to the airport or to some other area, but that might include de-emphasizing something else, right? And so just want to make sure that it's known it's probably an either or, but not often an and or both.
I'm not sure what Councilmember Holstage is suggesting when it comes to investigation of reserve policy here.
It's really hard to have this conversation, at least for me, because I don't see what would be additional capital improvement projects that are next in line at the airport that could be considered compared to keeping money in the fund, in the airport fund. And so I do know, obviously it's an enterprise fund, but there are others, there are sources of funding that we could consider for those projects. So, if staff's recommendation is that, these are the improvements we should make right now, and we should make no further analysis of additional capital projects at the airport at this time, then that's the recommendation. So, but that's my question is that something that we should further investigate?
And if I could clarify, I wouldn't say that we can't consider other things, but that you would want to balance those considerations both with, what we're trying to accomplish at the airport and elsewhere in investing in capital improvement. So the fund balance that we have remaining at the airport, similar to the fund balance that we'll review in our capital fund, right now isn't being held for a rainy day or to be cautious or anything like that. We're simply identifying what we think are the highest priorities up to and probably beyond our capacity to complete the projects. And then when we have more space, we go to the next one. So there's certainly, I think, an opportunity to talk about whether some investments are more important than the ones that we've proposed. Probably with the airport, and we might need more direction from Mr. Baird on this, but I don't know that we could supplant some of the customer experience investments for some of the life safety things that are just going to be needed and dictated by FAA. But when it comes to things like carpet and restrooms and some of the things that are a little more discretionary, we probably do have an opportunity. And if we wanted to accelerate some of those next improvements in line that might not be scheduled until 23, 24 or further years, we can do that, but that would also have an impact on our ability to pursue other capital improvements in parks and other places. So you might want to hear some of what we have planned for the rest of our capital fund before deciding whether or not you want to accelerate certain improvements at the airport, if that makes sense.
Did you want me to add to that? Or? Yeah, so we can absolutely look at other projects. I think the thing to keep in mind is we have an obligation to go back to the tenants and vet those projects with the tenants. And under our current agreement with the airlines, they actually do have veto power under that current agreement. So they can block a project if it's funded with their funds for the airport. The other thing I'll say is that there are other avenues for us to pursue those things via grants, but that's coordination with the FAA as well.
Thank you. And I was mostly referring to customer experience improvements because there are more that we need than carpets and restrooms. So that's helpful. Thank you. And for the city manager, just really fast. So the limiting factor in terms of doing additional capital improvement projects, can you just explain that for the public about why it's an either or?
Yes, so not to get too far ahead, but we're right on the cusp of talking about our capital improvements plan as it is. Right now, our team that oversees capital projects has about $333 million of active projects. So some of those are in a phase of early planning, some of them in design, some of them are almost finished, but not finished. And so there's frankly, that's a staggering number for me. When I understand the size of our team, and the volume of work, to just be frank, it's too much. We should not be doing that much simultaneously. So we've got to go through some period of clearing some of those projects so that we can take on virtually anything new. And what you'll see here in a minute when we present the capital fund is a lot of the next 12 to 24 months of projects have already been decided. Some of them as long ago as 2016 for projects that just aren't done yet because there was a call for funding a while ago, et cetera, et cetera. So we're already contemplating adding capacity to the team. We submitted a budget request to council for an additional project manager or engineer to help oversee things. But if we issued that project manager position today, that person is probably fully up and running in about 12 months, maybe 6, but flying solo, so to speak, a little longer. So there's just not much on the horizon of this budget to just add. We can replace, but it's difficult at this point to add because some of the decisions that were made many, many years ago, those projects just still aren't done. And again, we'll explain that a little more in detail on a project-by-project basis so council understands that. But the bottom line is there just isn't a lot of space to add new without removing something.
Due to internal staffing capacity, is that what you're saying?
Yes, and then the other issue with the airport in particular is that we need to complete some of those life safety type improvements that are dictated by the FAA. So what we're really doing there is looking to either deprioritize some of those customer experience capital improvements for others or potentially adding to them. So like I said, we could accelerate something that's planned for 23-24 to get it done, 24-25 to get it done in 23, but that would probably take at least limiting some of the other projects we want to invest in other areas like parks or facilities, given the capacity issues I described. So it's a little bit of both, the capacity overall, but then within the airport, we also are limited in how many projects we can trade in and out because of the emphasis on those life safety projects.
Thanks, that's helpful.
Other questions or comments? Councilmember Woods.
Could I ask Mr. Director Barrett to come back up, if you would mind, for a minute? And I'll just ask, and I don't know who's going to answer. First of all, for those who don't know, congratulations on your promotion to the director position of our airport. So yay, I know it was announced last night at State of the City, but I wanted to announce it to a broader audience tonight. And I can't think of a better person at this point, and I've gotten incredible feedback from residents, and my district is very impacted by the airport. So thank you for your conscientiousness with dealing with those residents. The questions I'm going to ask are just a little better understanding. It may be captured in the city manager's response of those ongoing projects that are already funded, but I want to ask about a couple of those to make sure that we're okay. One of them is, we redid our baggage handling, and I know it needs some tweaks and stuff. Is that funding in there and available to make that happen?
We have funding available for it. We haven't identified a cost for it only because we're still in the assessment phase of figuring out what needs to happen with the baggage handling system. So once that assessment is done, we're looking at about 2 months. Then we can determine from there what needs to happen in terms of any additional capital investment or whether we need to make some operational changes.
And does the money that we get for that baggage handling system, does that come from the airlines, or is that a city responsibility? I'm just.
In terms of in future capital investment?
Yeah, like let's say it's going to cost $20,000. I'm just using a very low number, but to fix it.
We would use the money that we have on hand, but there would likely be a combination of funding sources. So our passenger facility charges, any additional grants, discretionary or entitlement from the FAA, and we would likely go to the airlines to discuss fees and negotiate with airlines as well.
Great. The other question I had about a project that we've been working on is, setting up a much better car rental facility, and that was a huge capital project. If I assume it's still funded, or where are we at with that?
Frankly, that's on hold, and part of the reason, as Justin mentioned, is because we don't have the capacity in-house to work on that project.
Okay.
We've got a number of other issues that we need to tackle before we can get to that.
Okay, fantastic.
And that said, quickly, you might want to just explain that we have brought to council some revised fees that are meant to accumulate some dollars anticipating that capital cost, and there has been some very conceptual level planning that we would intend to follow up on, I think, over the course of the next year approximately, to start making more concrete decisions on what that build-out will look like.
So, we approved, this is a minor issue, but we approved kind of a sustainability landscaping. And is that fully funded at this point, or is that something we need to, it's probably a smaller amount, but.
Yeah, I believe that's fully funded, but not out of the airport budget.
Okay, all right, great, good, that's good to know. And then painting the signs white and keeping that maintained and all of that, is that out of the airport budget, or is that out of the city budget?
That's out of the airport budget.
And that's fully budgeted, that type of maintenance?
Yes.
Okay, and the last question, thanks, is, we had an issue where we were at capacity with our parking. Do we need any improvements with that? Either, it's an odd system we have. I say odd, but I just.
You're exactly right. So that's one of those future projects that I was referring to earlier that we have on our list to manage, and that includes potentially a new revenue system and, maybe reconfiguration of the parking or maybe some land acquisition. We don't quite know yet, but that's something that we plan to bring to the council in the future.
So that's not part of this funding cycle? Okay, great, thank you.
Just to expand a little bit, we do have numerous projects ongoing. You referenced a couple of those. Some of the others with some of our shared space at gates, et cetera, is ongoing, but we also intend to start really looking comprehensively at planning simultaneous to that. So we're really looking forward and anticipating things like rental car facilities, parking space, remainder of available property on the airport, anticipating more robust growth, all of those things.
Any other questions or comments from anyone? Councilmember Holstich.
Thank you. I just have one more follow-up question. So I'm trying to wrap my head around this. So if internal staffing for project management is the cap on our ability to, do additional projects at this time, even though, the residents are asking us to make additional capital improvement projects in our community, both at the airport and through the city. So I know we have unions and we have, limitations in what can be in-house and what can be contracted, and we prefer in-house definitely. But is that something that we can use consultants for or other external people to get some of that stuff done that really needs to get done at the airport or throughout the community?
We do use consultants. It's certainly a blend, and when our city engineer comes up, he can tell you a little bit more about the blend. But we rely pretty heavily on consultants as it is. And yes, we can look to ramp up. I think one of the conversations we want to have is what do we consider a kind of sustainable approach to capital improvements. So there was a conversation when we presented the general fund about it being difficult to assess the new investments proposed for operations without knowing where we're at with capital. So that's going to be part of the way we frame the conversation today to better understand our approach there. When you look at incoming revenue to the capital fund, which we'll look at in detail here in a bit, I really think it provides some unique opportunities to invest. And a lot of those are without looking at things like the airport. But when you start to add to the incoming sources that are going to total tens of millions of dollars, you start to add airport, wastewater, and some of the other areas where we have purview, it really is a lot. We can staff up 2 or 3 or 4 positions to accelerate, but we wouldn't want to get so far out in front that we're kind of racing to the finish line and we're going to spend an accumulated balance and then not have as much to invest in and have a team that's oversized. So we would like to discuss what makes sense in terms of a sustainable approach. I would also say that, staffing isn't quite just plug and play. So adding a project manager, you probably don't have to tinker much with the structure of our engineering team. Add 3 or 4 or 5, or add a number of other consultants, and you really do need to start to look a little bit more deeply at the management structure to make sure that you can still maintain everything. And I would point out, without saying anything too incendiary, but we have projects sometimes that don't close out as well as they should, right? So we want to be careful not to have so much going on simultaneously that there are things that we might otherwise catch in the process that we don't. We don't know when we enter into a project whether it's going to be an excellent contractor or a decent one or a not very good one. And when that happens at a really large-scale project, we could not only be doubling our workload involved in overseeing that project, but the project could extend for many, many, many months beyond when we anticipated it closing because we're in dispute resolution and trying to figure out what happened. That is happening too often, and so we need to be more thorough, not less. So I'm just cautious that even if we grow in a managed way so that we ensure quality. I don't mishear me that I think we need to go super slow, but at the end of the day, we want to find the right balance between quantity of projects and the quality of those projects. I think we can invest tens of millions every single year. Some of those are going to be really high-profile fun projects that all the community sees, and sometimes it's a buried sewer line or a culvert or something that isn't as exciting, but is still valuable to the community. If we can find that right balance and grow into a higher capacity, I think that's realistic. It would be difficult to kind of turn on a dime and grow that capacity substantially within a number of months, if that makes sense.
Thank you.
Any other questions or comments? All right, then, Mr. Barrett, thank you.
So I've given away some of my notes to set up the conversation on capital improvements, but before Joel and his team come up, I do want to just say a couple of other things. So in terms of big picture, we've covered our operating account, which is the general fund. We've covered our really significant enterprise fund, our business type fund with the airport, and now we're going to turn attention to capital improvements. Capital improvements really is our investment in assets. We take in a number of revenue sources that accumulate and help us complete those projects. Some of them are restricted in nature, some of them aren't. And what we've done effective last year is we've created a longer-term outlook on capital projects, so we really know what's coming. So we have what we propose to be a 5-year rolling planning horizon. And we're going to focus a lot on the funded year and the year that's a part of the budget, because that's really the capital improvements plan itself is 127 pages and a lot of information. So we want you to be able to participate and understand what kind of projects are contemplated in those future years, and again, give us some advice on where we should accelerate some and maybe defer others, add things that aren't on the list at all. But some of our program has just already been established by previous decisions. What's interesting about capital planning is the time it takes to designate a project and to put it in the hopper could be an hour conversation at council, and it could be 7 years worth of work. Maybe a couple of those years are just early planning, looking for property or space, and then a more intense period for design and construction. But that ratio is kind of a setup, right? That all the fun work to identify the $333 million of projects that our team is currently working on in some way, shape, or form is gone, but the work still remains. And so we really just need to work on balancing that and ideally taking on fewer projects simultaneously, especially because some things come up unexpected. So for instance, when the 5-year CIP was introduced last year, there was no plan to build a navigation center. Because grant sources arrived the way they did, we not only planned to build one, but we planned to build it very quickly. Well, when you are already taking on the volume of projects that our team is, it becomes hard to adjust. They do that as well as they can, but point being, we do need to leave a little bit of that capacity kind of on the table, so to speak. Similarly, some of the big bridge projects, we don't know when they're going to be funded necessarily. Sometimes Caltrans comes up with a new program and says, hey, we can do it sooner or later depending on the decisions you make. But even then, is that 12 months? Is that 24 months? We'll talk about some of that in detail, but that's some of the context that makes the capital planning a little bit difficult. Just a couple other quick caveats. I mentioned last time that Measure J, we came to learn, had reviewed the projects that are outlined in the capital improvements plan and designated for Measure J funding, but they did not give formal approval or advance those as recommendations to council. So while some of those numbers are still in our capital improvements plan, we will not be presenting those numbers. Rather, we're going to present the projects that are contemplated. We're going to go to Measure J for a special session here in a couple of weeks or a week, and ask them for their recommendations on how Measure J should come to bear on those projects. It's possible that they'll have a project or two in mind that is not on the list, or that they'll see kind of some of the emphasis and funding differently. One way or the other, those funds are available and will come to bear on the capital improvements plan. So from a bottom line perspective, it doesn't change our ability to fund the projects. It's just some of the specifics of where those dollars go. Lastly, there was a conversation that I touched on about balancing the general fund and the capital fund. There's no magic way to do it. Most communities, all of the ones that I've served and most that I know of, don't often have a dedicated source like sales tax, TOT, or those kinds of things that generally land in the general fund. Some communities opt to make a transfer, a regular transfer every year. We do that. So recently, that in this budget is proposed to be $2 million, a fairly small amount considering the size of our capital fund. That's mostly enabled by a source like Measure J, which in my opinion, we're very, very fortunate to have. Thankful for the residents for approving those funds. That really relieves the burden, in my opinion, to invest additional discretionary dollars in the capital fund. As you'll see, by the time you layer Measure J, some of our other restricted sources, and grants, it really enables us to contemplate in some years, $60 million of projects. Big numbers when you consider that whole libraries and fire stations and things could fit within a year like that, big bridges, et cetera. So I think long term it really enables robust investment in our community, but it does happen in bits and pieces sustained over time, just like repairing roads, just like building out bike pads. So we'll talk about the specifics, but in my opinion, we really have ample resources there. If we wanted to shift significantly, we're going to go back to the conversation of capacity and develop more aggressive plans to reorganize in such a way that we could take on more at once, and that would take us a little while to do. Lastly, we've organized a lot of the capital projects under the headings of your priorities so that you can understand how they relate. Sometimes they fit in more than one. So I noticed some projects that are infrastructure, that they also happen to be parks, right? Ingress and egress at Demuth might not be as fun as the rec center itself, but it does help those spaces to be more functional. So they're organized that way so you understand how they connect. But as we review them, you'll better understand that really all of these are community projects that benefit residents, even the ones that they don't all see, like the sewer pipes and the drainage and things. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to our city engineer to provide some more specifics, and we're happy to answer questions as we go.
Good evening, Madam Mayor, members of the City Council. My name is Joel Montalvo. I am the city engineer. The city manager pretty much set up a lot of the things that I'm going to discuss. I will repeat myself. I'll repeat some of the information that the city manager provided. We'll go through the 5-year CIP. We'll talk about some of the 64 projects that we are actively working on. And I think this presentation, after the conversation that the city manager just had, is more set up to have a dialogue with council, to ask questions, to see if I have any information you might need. So I'll go through the presentation, but I think it's going to be better if we do have a dialogue back and forth. So what is the CIP? So the CIP is a budgeting and strategic planning tool. It's used to prioritize construction and public infrastructure and facilities for the next 5 years, and as well, it's meant to identify funding sources. California Government Code 65403 and the administrative element of the city's general plan requires that the city council review and adopt a capital improvement program each year. So prior to last year, the city was doing informal, multiple-year improvement programs. So we were establishing multiple-year improvement programs for the gas tax, Measure A, and we were also doing it for Measure J. So last year was the first year that staff prepared a comprehensive 5-year CIP from fiscal year 21-22 through fiscal year 25-26. So that was to strategically identify all the current multi-year and ongoing capital projects. So the CIP identifies all the projects that the engineering division will be working on for the next 5 years, along with all the funding sources. So in this slide, you can tell that we are not only using Measure J, but we also have multiple funding sources: the gas tax, Measure A, drainage, SB1, Quimby, and other federal and state grants. So we combine all those in different projects, and the CIP booklet now helps us organize and project over 5 years. So before we get into the actual CIP discussion, I want to sort of introduce you to what the department and the engineering staffing for engineering. So we have an administration, we have 4 segments to our engineering division. So we have the administration, capital projects, land development, and inspection. So we typically help with, our department helps with, we provide support and we interact with the general public, land developers, contractors, consultants, federal and state agencies, local agencies, commissions, 1PS, neighborhood groups, and other city departments. So for actually working on capital projects, we have 5 engineers, and we have 1 position that's vacant right now. So those 5 engineers are working on the 64 projects and the $333 million worth of projects. So that's something that the city manager was touching on earlier. So I'm going to go, I guess, I'm going to repeat myself, but I guess it is good to kind of go through the presentation. So we have 64 capital projects worth $333 million. Most of the projects were presented last year in the 5-year CIP, and as the city manager noted, the navigation center was not. But one thing to note is in the 5-year CIP, we didn't last year's CIP didn't have all the projects that were already fully funded and we were working on. So that's why last year we had 51 projects, I believe, in the CIP, but totally we had like 64 or more being worked on. And from then to now, we've completed some and we've added some. So what we did with these 64 projects, we used, the city manager mentioned, the council priorities. So we grouped the 64 projects into the 4 priorities: quality of life, environmental stewardship, community infrastructure, and good governance. In addition, we also segregated the projects into the airport projects. As you heard earlier, all the airport projects, at least the capital projects, are actually being touched by engineering. Engineering also is working on the wastewater plants, and we're working on federal bridge projects, state-funded safety projects, and other miscellaneous projects that don't really fit into a category. So as the city manager mentioned earlier, we are challenged with current staffing levels to deliver all the existing 64 capital projects and adding more projects every year. So in the following slides, I'm going to go through each of those projects and how they fit into the categories. We can go through them. There's a lot of them. I'll touch on a few of those projects as I go. And you can ask questions if you'd like, but this is essentially the list of 64 projects in the following slides. So the very first project that I have there is the homeless. Its quality of life is a navigation center, and it fits into the category of improved homelessness. For community infrastructure, deferred maintenance, we have a few projects there. The Autry Trail wind wall. I'm sure if you've driven on Autry, you see that there's a wooden fence out there holding sand back. We're working on a project that will make it a real tall fence, a wall. And we're going to do other improvements. The community center egress and HVAC improvements, that's a project that's ongoing right now. The city yard roof replacement, is a project.
Joel,
Sorry.
if I could ask a question.
Sure.
The Autry wind wall and guardrails, could you describe what that project's going to be in a little more detail?
I could. What we have designing is a full 10 to 14 foot tall block wall that will screen out the sand for about 120 feet, if I recall. And we're also putting center dividers on Autry so that cars don't cross the divider. So we're still in the design phases of that project.
And when this is completed, do you anticipate this will allow Autry to stay open more frequently? And if so, do you have any sense of how much more frequently we will be able to keep Autry open during heavy windstorms?
Unfortunately, that wall does not extend far enough to actually prevent the closure of Autry. It's going to prevent at the changing grade at approaching the freeway is where we have certain issues. That's what we're trying to resolve with this. But the actual closures could still happen because the wall will not extend the entire length of Autry.
We have had a number of collisions up at the far north end of Autry. Are you hoping that this will be something that will make the streets safer there?
Yes, that is the intent of this project.
Right, thank you.
Joel, could you explain, you've got numbers, and some of those are just for your purposes for understanding what number project it is, but can you explain how people might identify the year that the project started?
Sure. So each one of our projects is composed of 2 digits essentially, or 4 digits. The first 2 digits are actually the year when the project became an official project. So if you go down to our full list of projects, you'll see the very first one was started in 2001. And that's the Indian Canyon Bridge. So if you're looking at a project, you can go down and tell exactly when engineering made it an official project. Doesn't mean that that project didn't exist in one way or another before, but that's when engineering actually created a file and started officially working on the project. So if we move on, 3B in deferred or in community infrastructure, it accelerates street paving. So we have our yearly projects, annual slurry seal, and the annual pavement rehabilitation projects. I'm going to move to the next slide. So we have focus on parks and community assets. Here we have downtown park. It's still on there because we still are doing some things to that park. So as the city manager mentioned, projects sometimes linger on beyond construction and we still have to work on them. So even though it seems the project's done, staff is still engaged doing other things on the actual project itself, excuse me. So we have improvements to Demuth Park ADA. So recreation field lights right now is being designed. Pavilion acoustics right now is being designed. Playground resurfacing, we just wrapped up the last playground. Desert Highlands and Demuth Park restrooms are being constructed. So you can see we have active projects in parks and community assets. We also have, if you look to 3B, expanding walking and biking infrastructure. This is where the city manager mentioned that a lot of projects fit into different criteria for council priorities. So a lot of the highway safety improvement projects, you wouldn't think it's expanding walking and biking, but the technology we're using is meant to help the pedestrian experience at the intersections and provide safety. There's also local road safety plans that we'll get into a little bit later on, and the CV Link also. You think CV Link is being done by CVAC, but that actually has an engineer on our team working, meeting with them, making sure we're reviewing their traffic control, making sure they're following our specifications. So that project, even though it's not funded or being worked on directly by the city, is actually taking staff time.
Madam Mayor, may I ask a question? Thank you, Joelle, for the presentation. So you just had a slide up about the downtown park, and I know we've gotten a lot of questions about what further the city is going to do on it, especially with the substation there for the police department, and then that block that's chained off and closed, but it seems like the work has completed there. So could you just give an update on the park, please, especially that block E that's adjacent to it?
So I don't have any information on the block itself and what the city is planning to do with that block. It's open, I think it's city property, but I don't have any information on what future projects are going to be done in that block. It's cordoned off. I think our city crews are using it for certain things, but for now I don't have a plan, or I don't know of a plan of what's going on with that block.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Councilmember Holstich, for raising that question. I think the potential use for that block is one that calls for City Council to have some conversations about what are some of the options that we might have in terms of directions to take, and would be an important conversation for us to have somewhere in the future.
Thank you. We've just gotten feedback from surrounding community members that it's sort of adding to the blight of that area, or at least isn't contributing to that neighborhood, or excuse me, that area of town that we very much want to redevelop. So I would we've been asked for intermediary efforts to just clean it up and open it up. It really is blocking off half the downtown park. So sorry to, and it impacts how those view lines and access to the park. So sorry to bring it up here, but sometimes, this is a discussion about capital improvement programs and plans, and we could do something with that block if we wanted to. So thank you, Madam Mayor.
If I could just add to that, yeah, that's a great conversation to have if there's a property like that we want to elevate in priority. We have looked at it from kind of a conceptual point of view. There are some, there's uneven concrete, exposed rebar. There's some shoring and load-bearing issues, the same ones that we had when we built the park. So I think something shorter term and interim would still require, number one, reconciling a vision, and two, kind of dealing with some of those safety issues on the property, but we can certainly do that. Alternatively, if we wanted to do something even more short term, it might be improving the fencing to incorporate decorative banner style construction fence screening so that it was just aesthetically more pleasant. We're open to both. Something more long term would likely have to deal even more with some of the structural issues and things like that.
Is there a reason why we couldn't take the fences down, get all the material out of there, and simply put DG down so that it's useful to the park until such time as we identify a plan going forward?
We could certainly look at that as an option. I think when we start to consider things like exposed rebar, that might, I don't know if those are tie-in points for future, anything, but we would want to look at all of that carefully.
Agreed.
But it may be that some sort of grading and just, putting something down would work. I think Stacy Schaefer, our Director of Maintenance, has also looked into that, and she's here tonight, so I might just see if she has anything else to contribute to that.
Right, and I will note that the actual platform itself is limited on how much weight it could take. So if we, in order to cover certain differences in elevation to avoid tripping hazards, if we go beyond a certain threshold of weight, we could expose or weaken the top plate of that. So there's certain considerations, as the city manager mentioned, that we would look at.
That area is actually above the underground garage, correct?
Correct.
Okay.
Correct.
So one of the issues that we have described already is that, per square foot, we have a very limited amount of weight that we can put on. Right now, the footprint that is left behind was from a retail store in a previous life. So it's not just uneven, it is dramatically uneven with large sections missing, rebar still coming through. There's old generators we don't even know the tie-ins for. There's actually quite a bit in that area. It would be more than just level on the top. We would have to bring it down, grade across, and of course the weight would be concerns as we go through that. But just so we understand it, we're talking several feet of concrete that are uneven throughout that whole space. And we definitely will be looking into more decorative fencing options, but right now it's not something we would want to open up to the public for liability reasons.
So a little more difficult than just throwing some DG down.
Just a little.
All right.
Madam Mayor, if I could.
Please.
Thanks, Stacy, and I appreciate all the work you're doing for the city. You have a huge job as our infrastructure is deteriorating, so thank you for keeping it going. I agree with the questions of the mayor and with Councilmember Holstich. It is an eyesore in that place right now, and I know we're going to have a development that's going across from it. But we don't know what we're going to do with this, and exposed rebar is compromised if it's exposed to the elements. And I'm wondering if we should not spend some money to see what we need to do, because it doesn't sound like in the near future we have a plan for that site, so it could go on for years. And that may not be a good thing for either the structure, safety, or just the overall look. So do we need to put a little money in the budget to, or can we pull it from other accounts to make that happen?
Currently, we're already starting just internally, since we plan to use that for some minor staging. We already use that for some of the attic stock from the downtown park, for some of the benches and large concrete, extra fencing. We've already started grinding some of the edges, and we're trying to identify what rebar we have, where it's tied in, so that we can address that. And currently, it's covered just for internal staff safety, but we're going through that incrementally to try to address those issues.
Oh, great. Thank you.
Okay, back to the presentation. So here we have the other projects that I didn't quite tie them into council priorities, but they should stand alone. The federal bridge program that we have 6 federally funded bridges. Each one of those bridges is in different stages, if you will. And you can tell the old one there is, this project was probably envisioned before 2000, but it started officially in 2001. We're in 2022, and we're still working on it, trying to get it constructed. So you see the 6 bridges there. The most expensive one is 1010 Vista Chino Low Water Crossing Bridge. That bridge is going to cost approximately $100 million. So hopefully Caltrans and the state has the money to fund us when we're ready to go to construction, but that's a nice sized bridge. Excited to be part of that project. Between my principal engineer, Don, and myself, we're handling all 6 bridges, or working on them, if you will. And then miscellaneous projects that come up. We have the Riverside County Flood Control has awarded us 7 $6.2 million, I believe, to construct a storm drain line on Ramon Road right next to the high school. That project is almost completed, and that's a major construction project that's also going to occupy one of our engineers for at least a year. And that's going to be a very disruptive project, and we'll see, we're going to try to time it so it's being done when school's out, but that's a very important project. It's not sexy, but it is really needed, and the infrastructure as far as storm drain is concerned, the city is lacking, and we need to move to do some of those projects as well. And I'll move on. Other projects, as I mentioned, we're working on the wastewater project. So we have the Bogart Trail Lift Station. That project is being awarded or was awarded. Yeah, it's about to be awarded. 2025, the digester number 2 and gas flare improvement project. That's a $15 million construction project. So we have one team member that's working on our wastewater projects, and that same team member is also working on all the airport or some of the airport projects that you see below there. So what I was trying to show in these slides is all these projects. We have 5 engineers, and we're spread out trying to do all of them at different stages. So now I'm going to actually get into what are the objectives of the 5-year CIP. So the objectives are to promote sound financial planning, forecast funding needs and identify funding sources, meet the community and city council goals, and complete projects in a timely and systematic manner. So by having the first 5-year CIP last year, it starts us organizing ourselves and being able to move forward, right? We're still in the process. I think we're still ramping up to be better organized, but this presentation and the conversation the city manager is having with the council today is for that goal, to be able to be organized and deliver projects. So the CIP book itself, I'm hoping that the council got to click the link, go in there, look at the 5-year CIP, explore it. It is sort of, it could be overwhelming, if you will. There's lots of parts to it. But for us, it's a very good tool. It's actually the most important tool we have to look at each project. So when one of my project managers is approached about a project, I have them go and fill out this particular form. It sort of informs us what the project is. It actually, it tells us the description of the project, the justification, conformance to the city council priorities, conformance to the city general plan. Our CIP also is going to the planning commission for a finding of conformance. So we will be not only going to the Measure J commission with Measure J funding, but we also will submit a copy of the 5-year CIP to the planning commission. So this particular sheet itself gives us a cost breakdown. It provides project funding by the fund, the fiscal year, and we even get into the granular. It tells us what project account to bill to and where the money is coming back if we're actually getting reimbursed from Caltrans. So that sheet is very important to us, and I think it's the most important sheet of the actual 5-year CIP booklet itself. So any questions on the actual book itself, anything from council, anything that stood out, the organization of it?
Councilmember Woods?
If I read everything correctly, of the 125 pages, whatever it was, the digester project is $11 million. Is that correct? It's something like
I can look at the sheet to look exactly what it is. I don't know off the top of my head.
So I just wanted kind of, it's a chunk of change. Obviously, it's a needed entity. I just didn't know
So I'm
anything
turning to
about
Don, and Don's nodding his head. So it is an $11 million project. Those are projects that are hidden away, not very sexy, but they're absolutely critical to the city, and they are very costly.
And that I think that digester project actually comes out of this sewer fees. Am I correct on that? Okay, so it's not out of the general fund then.
No,
Great.
we have our own wastewater.
Thank you.
Councilmember Coors?
Great, thank you, Mayor. So just looking in projects to prioritize, and I see the relocation of fire station number 1. Where are we on, what is our plan for all the fire stations? Like how many years, how much money?
So
and
that
timing of that?
I don't know if we want to get to that conversation. I think we're going to get into it later on.
Okay.
But I don't know if the city manager or the fire department chief has a plan. One of the requests that he made. So another thing with that sheet I was talking about earlier, we actually send it to departments and they fill it out and they tell us what they need, and they essentially look for where we would get the funding for it. So I don't know if the city manager has any other information on the fire stations themselves.
Yeah, so this bite at the apple, so to speak, has been to create a 5-year plan and a rolling 5-year plan. And so it does identify the fire station of the greatest need and some other assets there, but isn't really complete planning for things like fire stations or other facilities. We might find those in other master plans, right? Like a parks master plan or a fire department. So I don't know. I have spoken with the chief about the need to address more than just one station, both because we have opportunities to improve response times by strategically locating those stations in a better way, but also some of them are somewhat obsolete based on size and amenities and aren't up to current standards. So I don't know exactly how those are planned. I think if we talk to him, he'd say we'll take those as soon as we can get them. But given the 5-year planning horizon we have now, we have as many projects really as we can handle. And so I think if there's any reason why we haven't really planned the others, it's simply because right now we have our hands full with what we have, including the fire station. That's the highest priority.
Thank you.
Pro Tem Garner.
Thank you. Question about all of these projects. Do we have timelines for when these will be complete? How many are to be done this year, next year? I'm curious when we'll be able to add new projects to our list. I agree with you that we need to complete what we have, but it would be helpful to know that timeline.
So that is a very difficult question to answer. Each project is unique. I know in other instances we've discussed this particular issue about how do you actually plan for a project. Typically we used to know how long a project would take and we would plan for it. But when you're working on digester systems, bridges, air conditioning systems, storm drain lines, each one of those projects is unique and has its unique timeline. And to be able to comfortably tell you today, I know when all these projects are going to be done so you can add more, it is very difficult to do that. That's why a 5-year rolling CIP is my best estimate. If you look at our sheets, our CIP sheets, I plan for 1, 2, 3, or 4 years. If in some projects I think I'm going to be in construction in year 4, but I don't know if I'm actually going to be in construction or if I'm going to be in the middle of construction or completed the next year, 2, or 3. It just depends on which project I'm working on.
Thank you. So to follow up on that, is there some way for us to know, okay, X number of projects have now been completed, we can discuss further projects, or can we make a list that then, as city staff feel we can address it, we can move forward with the next project? I understand that we're a bit in a bind with how many projects we have, but I also know that the community is interested in a whole host of things that are not on this list, and I want to be able to kind of figure out how we balance that and how we make sure that we're letting people know, hey, we hear you. Here's how we're going to prioritize this as we're able.
So I have a couple thoughts. First is you're right. This has been a long time in the making, right? We've heard in the community that we've talked about a library, for instance, for a long, long time. And part of the reason that it hasn't come to fruition is because we've sort of been in this pattern of, maybe thinking we can do more than we really can over a given period of time. So we've added some really smart language to the CIP already that starts to help people understand what, I can't remember the exact terminology, but what is essential and what is necessary and et cetera. But I think we want to add to that to start identifying some of the other things that might really matter. For instance, what of them are just absolutely necessary? They're non-negotiable and they're time-bound and they're tied to a point in time, whether it's because of a grant source or because improvements are driven by an external jurisdiction like the FAA or any number of other reasons, so that we have a component of our schedule that is fixed. And then from there, we start to identify the other projects based on those kinds of criteria, which ones do we think are the most important or the least? Which ones are fully discretionary, both in terms of the revenue sources and the timing, so that we can identify, sort of like we did with the general fund, we had a base budget and then a handful of decision packages with our available money or supplemental budget requests. The capital version of that would be, here's everything that's defined and kind of locked in, and here's the space we have to add new things. We are not saying that we can't have any conversation about new projects. In fact, I think one of the questions we have is, among some of our projects that are scheduled in out years, should we accelerate some before others, right? And that could even mean starting the early planning or design on something like a library next year. So we do have room for that conversation. We will get better and better through identifying these kinds of qualities of projects and getting better at projecting time, at least to the extent we can. As Joelle said, if Caltrans shows up one day, which they did some time a while ago, and said, by the way, if you engage in a certain kind of program where maybe you fund the bridge and we pay you back, we might be able to do it sooner rather than later. Those things sometimes just fall out of the sky. We have no idea, and then we have to decide, do we rearrange everything to accommodate that, or do we not? And we'll always have some element of that uncertainty.
Well, if Caltrans wants to fix the light at Visicino and 111, that would be great. I'm sending them emails all the time. So, okay, sorry, I got off track. This is helpful, and I think that if, we've talked about this before, being able to just continue to update the public on what the projects are and where they're kind of falling in the line of priorities. And you know what? I really lost my train of thought. I had to take a dig at Caltrans, didn't I?
Justin, I think one of the frustrations that we have on council is needing a better sense of what projects are where in terms of their progress towards completion, and what kinds of target dates exist for each one of the projects, so that when we're receiving questions, we've got a reference that we can go to that would give us a better sense of where we're at with a project.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, and we've talked a lot as a team about how to do that, and also how to better understand what we think the ideal capacity and pace is for the team. Again, sometimes when issues happen like bad contractors, you can't predict it, right? What you can do is predict that over 64 projects totaling $333 million, something somewhere is not going to go exactly right. So if we're planning on this to be an exactly fine-tuned, oiled machine, that's not going to happen, which tells me we need to kind of scale back. And again, the pattern has been a long time, frankly, of really kind of loading up projects but not always understanding how long execution takes. Even some of the fun ones that were conceived recently, the downtown park, I believe, had a date of 15 next to it. So it became a project 6 years before it was done. Those cycles could be shorter and faster, for sure, but only if we are either doing fewer projects simultaneously or we significantly ramp up our capacity. So some of the solution is to get out of that cycle of loading up too much so that we can say, great, we've got 30 projects rather than 60, and the timeframes are more reliable because we've really assessed our capacity and scaled to it.
One of the things we're also starting new is every time we take a project for award, we're going to get with our media folks and sort of tell the public this project is about to start. It's going to take about this long. This is who's in charge. This is how much it's going to cost. And we're going to get better at being able to tell the public what is going on, where it's going on, and when we anticipate it to be done. And then hopefully to that, we can add, the project is going longer and kind of get more information out to the public on each one of our projects. But we also typically, or on the bigger projects, we have signs. We can incorporate more information onto those signs that will inform the public of what's going on, and so to help with that situation.
Mayor Pro Tem Garner.
Thank you. I remember my question now. Since we've separated these out into CIP and the staffing the last time, Can you remind me in terms of any additional staffing or support we're providing to the engineering department? I think there was a project manager and possibly another engineer. Can you?
So two positions come to mind. One would be a project manager. That could be an engineer. It could be just somebody with background in project management. And then we've also recommended some administrative support that would be kind of split between building and engineering. So that's initially. We can grow faster in some areas than others. You know, sometimes I feel like I'm the bearer of bad news and I sound like the slow turning wheels of government. And I get that, but it's worth noting that what we're endeavoring to do going into next year with the kind of economic recovery we've had is probably make one of the most substantial investments, if not the most substantial, in growing the team that we've ever made historically. So this really is rapid progress, but it's rapid progress spread very thin because we're trying to do it in sustainability, in housing, in homelessness, in police, in fire, in maintenance, in fleet, you know, and literally across the board. So if we narrow that, it's easier to accelerate faster in some places, but it really is hard to manage those all simultaneously. We're not built like a tech company, you know, and we don't have the kind of profits where we can just scale up rapidly. It is a little slower and more deliberate than that. Part of that is because we're doing it everywhere and not in select places.
Other questions or comments? Councilmember Woods.
You know, I'm not sure this is the right opportunity to ask this, so if it's not, you can just tell me to defer it. I think that I saw, I just want to kind of two things. The relocation of Fire Station 1, just kind of, is it funded? Where are we at with it? Is it in planning? Is it, you know, it's obviously not in construction, is question one. And two, I think I saw in there $14 million, if I think it's correct, for the library. Again, I know we've done some planning. Where is it at? What are we doing? You know, I mean, I'm just curious.
Right, that's the last slide
right.
in our
I'll wait.
priorities is where we ask council, all these projects that are coming up, where, you know, how do you prioritize them? And
But I'm just curious where it's at now.
they're not funded yet.
They don't exist. Okay,
Correct.
so it's
Like
just
the library
something-
has been around for a while. We were putting money into it, but we have not made much progress on the actual design. But those are conversations I think we're going to have just on the last slide.
Right, and you're recommending that type of funding
Right.
in this
Yeah.
budget. Okay, great, thank you.
And to be clear, I believe both are included in the 5-year CIP conceptually in terms of when we would invest funds and then spend them. So generally, that pattern for major projects is save money for a year or two, then start design, then in construction, maybe the fourth year, and you're funding throughout. So both of those are contemplated.
Right.
The question we're going to ask you here in a bit is, do we have priorities between competing projects like that so that we know which one to start sooner and which one we can wait until later?
Right. So
Thank you.
yeah.
Thank you, Madam Mayor.
Okay. Other questions, comments? All right. Joel, you have answered this question for me in emails any number of times, but the Boger Trail Sewer Lift Station, certainly not a sexy project, but a really important one to the residents down there. What's the status on that?
That project was awarded or is going to, oh, there you go. It's out to bid. So we are actively pursuing a contractor for that project.
And if it, can you give me an estimated timeline?
I don't really recall what the time was for construction. Trying right now, I know I saw the specifications. We gave them the amount of working days, but I see so many of those. I can't recall this one in particular. I can send you an email to tell you exact details. But we will be bringing that project to council for award, and then I can answer a lot of those questions for you.
Very good. Thank you.
So we do have a little bit more, I think, in terms of prioritizing future projects, or are we done with the
No, I
presentation?
have one more slide, and
I
then
thought
we'll
so.
go into, yeah.
And as we get into that, I just want to point out for people who are interested, the capital improvements plan itself is a pretty behemoth document. But in particular, toward the end or after the first number of summary pages, there are pages dedicated to individual projects. So for instance, the whole thing's 127 pages. On page 29, there's a page for the library. And what you'll see there is, total cost, what's estimated for construction, administration, design, et cetera, and in what years, based on this draft, we contemplated starting to save money and spend money for a project like that. So that's a really good place if you're just interested in something very specific to look throughout. There's a lot of them to identify and wade through, but when you find the one you're looking for, you'll get some information. And again, those are the questions we're going to ask you here in a minute, is as far as some of those that are contemplated on the near horizon, which ones are most important so that we can start to set the expectations we're talking about for some of these and add a level of certainty that we don't have.
So one of the most requested responses are folks asking about when is my street going to be paved? That is one of the most frequent emails, phone calls. I've written so many emails that I can't even recall over the last 4 years, approximately 4 years, that I've answered that question so many times. And I know one of the council priorities is to accelerate paving, and the question has come up, well, what is the right number? How much money do we give you to accelerate paving? And just with our pavement management plan that we did in 2018-19, the right number, and is what we've been requesting and what we did last year, is about $6 million worth of paving is what our program tells us would keep our pavement condition index at or around a 74, which is satisfactory. But it, slowly, once we get to satisfactory and we keep on investing the $6 million, we start moving our PCI up. This summer, as part of this budget, we're going to start the next pavement management plan review. We're going to survey our streets. We're completely different than we were in 2014, 2018. So in 2022, 23, we'll have another pavement index. And if I can, I'm going to keep it to 2 digits after the decimal point, so we don't go to the arguments of why my 0.004 is better than my 0.005 neighbor's PCI. So we are keeping all those things in mind, and we deal with these projects so frequently that we're getting better and better at them. So what would prevent me from paving all our streets using $6 million and going from worst to best as we've been doing? Well, there is a challenge. On the left side of your screen there, you can see what would be next year's paving project. You can't read it, but it's really not meant for you to read. It's meant to show you the highlighted streets. Those highlighted streets, in our coordination with Desert Water Agency, we send our list to them, and then they look at it to see if there's any conflicting projects. So you can see all the highlighted streets there are actually streets that Desert Water Agency wants to replace their unlined steel water mains. So it sort of makes sense. Our worst streets also have the worst infrastructure. They were sort of constructed at the same time. These streets have unlined water mains that are failing. And Desert Water Agency has a program now to start investing more and more monies. We had a meeting with them not too long ago. I requested see if they could come to the city council to present their 10-year plan. And what you see on the right, you see in red all the streets throughout the city that have those unlined steel water mains. So it's a problem. If we want to go from worst to best with our PCI, we're going to start eliminating a lot of these streets, because we don't want to go in, reconstruct a street, and then have Desert Water Agency come right behind us and undo what we just did. So what we're going to do, and I think I'm going to ask council for permission and at least introduce you to this concept, is we're going to actually start skipping around. We're not going to go from the worst to best PCI. We're going to pick streets that are not in conflict with Desert Water Agency while developing a program with Desert Water Agency so they can start doing their worst areas first, and then we come right behind them to fix those streets. So I think it's going to take about 1 or 2 years to stagger the projects, but once we do that and we're in tune and we're meeting regularly, I think we can start blowing again and going through all the streets that are in bad condition. So that's my plan. That's what I'm bringing to you. So there's always, a challenge, and right now the challenge to pave the streets is working through the Desert Water Agency infrastructure.
Joel, I jump in. devil's always in the details, but right along with why hasn't my street been paved, I think the second most number of complaints we get is, why did they dig up my street right after it got paved? So I'm glad that you're addressing that issue. It's been one that's been out there. And having a 10-year plan from DWA in terms of what they're proposing to do, that's the kind of thing we can easily explain to the public when it comes up. So it's going to come down to being able to have detailed information that we can take and relay to the public. But for the streets that we need to defer, that creates an opportunity for other streets to be brought in. And so a little bit earlier.
Yes, yes, definitely.
Okay. I know you've been asked this question by me before. But do we really need any decimal points after the PCI score?
I think we need two decimal points after.
And why is that?
I just think there's lots of streets. Well, the system is computer-based, right?
Yeah.
So there is a human does go and reviews the streets and gives an estimated score. But there's other factors that go into the pavement program. When it was last serviced, what kind of treatment it had, some pavement. So it generally, the number is computer generated, and it picks a score, and it goes to, unfortunately, lots of decimal places. So that's my explanation. It is more technical, and I can get you more information, but it is a combination of human and computer technology that gives us a decimal point.
So I'm not trying to be difficult, Joel, but if you can show me a picture of a street that's 55.12 and a street that's 55.32, and define what the difference is between those two streets.
Yeah, I would have a hard time doing that.
I will take my hat off.
I will have a hard time doing that, but I will say that because our infrastructure is so degraded, or was so, it had been not maintained for a very long time, the only real way to separate streets is through a process of this PCI score. If they were all round numbers, we would have probably 200 with the same round number. And how do you then divvy those up? Sure. The PCI score has allowed us to be have no input from anyone. These are the next in line, and then we move forward from there. If we didn't have that, I think it would be chaos.
I'm not sure I agree with you, particularly if all we're talking about is going to an even a number, 55, 56, 57.
Yeah, I would just offer, as long as we have an ability to objectively prioritize, and that's based some on grade, it's based some on what streets are in proximity to others so we can deploy work efficiently.
Right.
It's about where we anticipate other work like water lines to be done in the next few years. Hopefully we can predict more of that than not, but
Right.
sometimes you just miss things and a water line breaks or whatever. So as long as we have a methodology to approach it objectively, it doesn't matter whether you call it ABCD or 55, 56.
Right, I agree.
The decimal points
Right.
help us justify to our residents that there was something behind their street not getting done while maybe a neighbor's street did. But at the end of the day,
And in the next cycle of this program, I'm definitely going to look at those factors, and
Right.
hopefully we can come up with something different.
Don't get me wrong, I'm absolutely in favor of a objective approach. But we need to make certain that we're being truly objective and not just simply creating numbers that really do not have a justification.
Agreed.
And the system of going from worst to best and the adaptation is what I interpret you're doing here, is adapting worst to best because we don't want to take and pave a street and then have it know it's going to be torn up next year. That's something we can explain to people. One of the difficult parts of asking for how much more money can we put into street paving to accelerate is we're in a situation right now where asphalt prices, as I understand them, are through the roof because oil prices are so elevated. And certainly one of the criteria I would think would be appropriate when we want to accelerate is to try to time it in such a way as to when the fluctuating oil market is somewhat at its lower levels. And I know we can't predict that with ease, but we know today we are at as high a level of oil prices as we've experienced in the last decade. Councilmember Woods.
Thank you for your attention. Obviously, street paving is a big issue with residents for whatever reason, and and rightfully so. But I just want to be clear on something. Your slide showed that there is a request of $6 million from Measure J for street paving. Is that the full budget, or is that just the amount that you're requesting from Measure J?
That would be one and the same. It's the full budget.
It's the full budget.
It's the full budget that we're using for
So $6 million,
paving.
okay.
Correct.
And does that include the slurry seal program as well?
No,
Okay, that's a separate budget item.
correct.
Okay, which is preventative maintenance
Correct.
to the roadway. Okay, and does that slurry seal process follow the same PCI that the road repaving does?
It does.
Okay.
It does, with some variation. Right now, what we're looking at is starting to vary from that PCI because we want to start slurring the streets that we did in 2015-14 that have a better score, and they have the higher score, right? We want to go there before we go to other streets. So generally, you're trying to keep your best pavement in working condition for a longer period. So we're going to start fluctuating a little bit from what we were doing in the past, adding more of the newer streets to that. Because what you get from a layman's point of view, they see that we're working on a street that we just touched not too long ago. They get very upset because their street's not done yet. So that we're trying now to start doing that to be able to expand the life cycle of our streets that we recently paved.
And we have contractors that do all this work. City staff doesn't do the actual work. We
Correct.
contract that out. So out of the 125, and you might not be able to pull it out, how much is for the slurry seal budget?
We are doing about $1 million a year in slurry seal.
And is that sufficient to protect our roads from further deterioration?
I think it is, yes. I think
Okay.
$1 million is what we've been budgeting, and I think we can, bring it up a little bit, but I think we're covering enough ground when we're doing the $1 million that we're going to catch up to our good streets fairly soon.
Okay.
So, yes, and we're going to, once we catch up, we're going to be right behind. So we're going to do our pavement management, and then 5-6 years later, we'll be doing our slurry.
And if I remember correctly, help me if I'm wrong, the slurry seal comes from gas tax. Is that correct? It comes from a different fund that's not Measure J.
It is not Measure J.
It's not Measure J. Okay, great, thank you. Oh, one last question. I had a brief discussion, but I think it's important for the public and for my fellow council members to understand is, that, the question is, why don't we put $8 million towards repaving or $2 million towards slurry seal? And I think the public, needs to know that there's disadvantages to doing that. And I don't know if either one of you can answer that or not.
So I'd be happy to take a stab at it. A couple things to consider. There's been a lot of science developed over the last number of years on how to maximize your investment and get the greatest return out of your road system. That's when state DOTs and other departments started saying, we're better off to preserve pavement earlier. And sometimes if your road is already past the point of being preserved, there's a window of time where it's going to degrade to need some sort of mill and overlay or something like that, but not so much that the street has to be completely rebuilt. And it almost doesn't matter when you do it in that window, it's going to cost the same. But if you start to invest earlier in preservation, you're going to extend the life. Think of it as owning a car and neglecting to change the oil. So the engine kept failing and you kept replacing the engine on a schedule and finally figuring out we need to replace the oil every 5,000 miles. That's efficient. Replacing the oil every 1,000 miles is overkill. Right? And to borrow the car analogy, our roads, especially once you resurface them. So not just a slurry seal, but something more significant. You want that road to be old when you do it. You want to get all the life out of the road that you can. Otherwise, you're spending more money than you need to. So it would be like trading your car in and you're ready for a new one. But what if you never got resale for the used car that you were trading in? You just had to get rid of it. You probably wouldn't trade it in every 2 or 3 years because that costs way too much. You'd want to get the life out of it. You might not run it into the ground, but you're not going to trade it in 2 or 3 years. Well, we don't get resale, so to speak, out of our roads either. So if you invest in pavement that can last 30 years and you replace it in 10, you're tripling your cost. And this is some of the most expensive infrastructure that a city has anywhere. You just really can't afford to sink that much money into maintaining A-level service roads, 8 million, 10 million, 12 million. It would be nice, but it'd be staggering costs, and it wouldn't be as cost efficient. Doing it exactly the right way, changing the oil on the schedule, replacing your belts and things like that so that the car lasts a long time, but eventually replacing the car, that's really the sweet spot. Same thing with roads.
Other questions or comments? Right. Joel, keep on running.
So I think we're approaching the last slide here. So this is a slide that we wanted to get to, and these are the projects that we want council direction or discussion on. These are all the projects that I think were being asked about earlier. We have 9 projects here that are, for the most part, are newer projects, but they are projects that are a high priority to the community, and we want some input from council. So the first one is Project 1608, which you see this project was envisioned probably in 2015, and in 16 it became an official project. So the main library renovation. I know we've applied for a grant, and if we get the grant, which I believe this summer, we're going to do, I think it's about $10 million or $14 million worth. We have to match half of it, so it's 7 and 7. So that project, if we get it, is going to be highly important, and staff is going to have to jump on it right away to work on. Very similar to the navigation center. I'm not listing it here. I think it's high priority for council, but if we get once we get the grant, that project is going to be high priority as well. So going down to number 2 is the round.
Joel,
Sorry, yeah.
Let's spend some time talking about the library before we
Sure,
jump down.
sure, no, definitely.
All right, thank you. I'm not sure if anyone else has questions. I certainly do. Joe, we've spent a lot of time over the years talking about the library and put a committee together a couple of years ago to look at potential options for the library. And as I understand it, the direction that council gave was to identify a landscape architect or an architect to look at reimagining Sunrise Park to better connect the various features of that park, from the senior center to the Boys and Girls Club to the pavilion to the skate park to the library itself, and to integrate the rehabilitation of the library into a new imagined Sunrise Park. So could you tell me where we're at with that project?
We have several people here that are going to talk about the global. We do have Jeannie from the library here. Don, also our principal engineer, has worked on it. So we have a good team here that could answer your questions. Right. My job was to try to program it for 2 years and when we can actually construct it, but I'll step back.
Okay.
Thank you, Madam Mayor and Council. That project, that group of meetings that we had was in August, September, October of 2019, and then the pandemic hit. And so that's where we are. I'll be realistic with you. I think that we had a financial crisis with the city, and so honestly, nothing has happened since then. So we're ready. We're ready to start doing some things with the library and the Sunrise Park and all of that.
So 2 quick notes. Whenever we commence that project, it could include the reimagining of the park and the integration of uses. And I think we'll also talk to you next time we come back to talk about the general fund about asking for funding for a general parks master plan, because we probably want to both decide between some of our parks, what kinds of uses are we contemplating, and then start to zero in on certain ones, whether there's an anchor project like a library or rec center or something else, and fine tune the vision for some of those really key parks like Sunrise.
I can appreciate broadening this to a master plan for all of our parks. But I think that's a discussion that we do need to have with council. And if there's anything that has changed in terms of the vision of the need to reimagine Sunrise Park, that's something that I know all of us on council want to be a part of that conversation. If all that's happened is we've been held up for 2 years because of COVID, but we're ready to go with what we were talking about 2 years ago, or 3 years ago now, then without speaking for everybody else, Godspeed and let's get going.
Yeah, I think,
Councilmember Woods.
just to quickly say, we would probably deal with the prioritization first, and any project that's prioritized, we would want to pick up where we left off, but also check in with council, let you know where we're at, make sure we're still headed in the right direction, and then we would proceed.
Councilmember Woods.
Thanks, Jeannie. Can you just, for my edification, the public's edification, because I think there's an allocation of $14 million in the budget. We've done planning. I think a plan has been prepared. I don't know what it's gone through different committees and commissions and boards or the council. Where are we at?
So a little bit of history. I started in the city of Palm Springs in 2012, and then in 2013, we did work with a consultant, did an entire program where consultants came in. They looked at what the library needs as far as everything, service, shelf space, chairs, parking, all of those things. So they developed a wonderful program of what's needed and what's working. And then the architects did a design. Now, again, this is 2013, so a lot has changed. It's a decade. So I think the plan's not completely dead. I don't think it's something we would throw away, but I think that it's time to take a look at it again and see if that's still the same priorities that we need, and and just build on that. So there was a plan. It was a great plan, but it got stalled at the council level and just financially. I think it was just the financial problem, but just the dollar amount. It was shocking to find out how much it was going to cost.
So, I just don't want to make another plan that sits on the shelf or even update the plan if we don't have a long-term plan for funding and actually making it happen, right? And I think there was some grant money that was involved, and is that, do you know the timing of that? How, it's just that's a lot of money to sit on the shelf if we don't have a plan, and we got to create a plan, and we don't have the grant money yet. I just want to step it properly. That's what I'm trying to understand. I think
we're in a great place right now. I applied for an infrastructure grant with the California State Library. It's the state of California was issued $439 million to be allocated for library infrastructure projects in the state. It is poverty-based, so communities with the highest poverty levels are going to get priority. We're about in the 70th percentile, so we're not, we've got a pretty good competition level. I think I'm excited, I'm optimistic, and we did apply for $7.1 million, and we have to match that, so it's about a $14.2 million project. It can only be used on infrastructure. The timeline on that is that they are going to make the announcement sometime in spring or summer of this year. So we should know pretty soon. And I think that I think the total number of requests that came in were about 500 million in applications. So we'll see. And then it is, like I said, it's a matching grant. We have to have the project completed by 2026. So there's some time allowed for the project to be designed and built.
So putting money aside like we're trying to do will help us if we get that grant money to leverage the most money to help our library. Is that what I'm understanding?
Absolutely. And I think that doing this process the way we're doing it now is very helpful, because if we get the commitment of the funds, then the project won't stall when we say we're ready to go. And then we've got everything in the right order so that we can just go.
Okay, great, thank you. So just to go back to the city manager and to Joel, thank you very much. That's very informative. So if we're trying to prioritize these projects that was put up on the slide, right? At this point, it seems like that priority is based very much on trying to get some grant infrastructure money, and then if that comes through, then we can do it, and if it doesn't come through, we can look at it again, if we've got it budgeted as far as what's first to do or second. I think that's what you're trying to extract from us.
That's exactly the kind of input we're looking for. So it's arranged at the top of the page. That's not to presuppose that it would be first, but when you look at the other projects, it is the oldest, and as we heard, it was identified formally by engineering in 16, but Jeannie was doing planning in 12 and 13. So if council were to say this is our highest priority, one of the first things we'd probably ask is, what if we don't get funding? If we get funding, that almost forces the hand, right? Because you want to take advantage of that funding. But council could say, we want to fund it one way or the other as quickly as we can, and that will have one impact on, the other projects and how we approach the CIP. Or you might say it's important, but we want to be able to successfully leverage grant funds. So if we don't get this round, let's keep looking, or something like that. That is the direction we're looking for.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions or comments? And I can't see now I can. All right. Joel, go ahead and proceed.
Just moving on in the list, the next project there is the roundabout at Indian Canyon, South Palm Canyon, and Paracela. That one I brought to council a while ago. I got approved to go to design. In the context of everything I presented today and the priorities, where was that project? Where does that sit? Do we finish design, which we have the funding for it, and we shelve it until we get through a lot of the backlog, or what do we do? So that's why that project is there. So I'm going to go down to the next program there. It's the local road safety plan that we just recently completed, and we will be bringing to council, I think it's the next council meeting, or 2 council meetings from now, the local road safety plan and the pedestrian safe routes to school master plan to present to council. So as part of that plan, we received a grant from Caltrans to prepare the plan, and that plan is now complete, and it identifies 32 intersections that need work. And without that plan, we can't apply for a grant. So we have the first piece, which is the plan itself. We'll bring it to council to receive and file. And then after that, it could potentially lead to 32 intersections that get some sort of feature. It's to improve the pedestrian experience, to improve technology. So there's multiple projects within each one of those intersections.
Joel, are any of those intersections changing from left turns that are both by arrow and yield to arrow only?
We are actually doing that with our previous highway safety improvement project. So we have the HSIP Cycle 7, which is under construction, Cycle 8 and Cycle 9. Between all those, we have about 20 to 30 intersections that we're essentially doing that type of work.
So when I recently sat down with a couple of our traffic officers and asked them what would make the biggest difference in terms of traffic safety, what I heard was the elimination of the yield left turns to be arrow only.
Right,
Would you come to the same conclusion?
I believe that's why we applied for those grants and received them, and that's where the direction we're heading.
I think we're going to have some public education needs to do, but I certainly concur. We'll make our left turns a little more slowly at times, but we'll make them much more safely.
So that one,
Councilmember Woods.
The same with the library. Does this, once we get the grant, does it have to be expended from Caltrans within a certain period of time? I mean, what's the urgency, or do we have to wait for that, and when might that come in?
For these particular projects, they're cycle projects. They want you to be spending the money, so we have cycle 7, and then we're working on cycle 8, and then cycle 9. So they do want you to get, I think there's a certain point where they will stop giving you funds if you haven't completed your projects. I don't know the exact timeline, but yes, there is some sort of time frame where you do have to expend dollars.
But we've already been awarded those dollars.
Absolutely,
So it's just
for
a
at
matter
least 3 of the cycles, correct.
Got it. Okay, thank you.
Other questions, comments? All right, Joel, keep on going.
So the next project is our annual traffic calming projects. I show on the slide that we're completing 5 to 7 per year, but really that's about 20 to 30 applications that we receive or more per year. And just that project alone has one of my staffers or one of my engineers working hundreds of hours to get down to the 5 to 7 projects per year. And it's pretty overwhelming, or it's just a lot of work to get to the final result, which we try to build now. We're grouping into every year. I think it's important. And this year, moving forward, I started budgeting now $500,000 a year to complete those projects. But one of the notes that I want to make is that that project alone is taking hundreds of hours of one engineer. So the next one down is relocation of fire station number 1. That one was presented by the chief. He filled out the project sheet. He estimates the cost to be around $16 million, and I think it's a high priority for the chief and I think for the city to build the fire station or to relocate it. But it's noted here so that council can discuss it.
Are there opportunities for outside funding for moving the fire station?
I'm sure we can explore them. Off the top of my head, I'm not certain what grants there would be.
Right.
But for this particular project, what I envision is setting aside the first year, which would be this fiscal year, $1.6 million, which would start the process. And then next year, we would look at maybe $3.6 million, and then in the next 2 years, maybe $9 million each until we have the full $16 million to build it. So in my mind, that's how I envision it, but it would depend on council priorities. We can move it sooner, and also on staffing levels and the end of this discussion, I guess. So next on the list there is the Measure J community initiated projects. That's the $1 million that Measure J gets every year. They reached out to the community and did a whole program, and from that it generated 14 distinct projects. Some of them will be just handing money over, but a lot of them will involve a lot of engineering time to try to sort through, get proper cost estimates, and actually deliver those projects.
Mayor Pro Tem Garner.
Do we have a list of what those projects are?
I think in the sheet itself, I think
Do
we
you know what
might have
page it's
removed
on?
it, but one of the things that, let me see, I don't know if I included it at 22. Actually, in the actual CIP, we did include it.
What page?
It's actually, well, it's
page 114 out of 127 in the capital improvements plan. So if you have the link to that document, that will get you to the list, I believe.
I can read them out if you'd like. I don't know if they will.
That might, here it is, I see it. Thank you.
So the next on the list is the pedestrian safe routes to school master plan. So that plan was another grant that we received. We completed it, and that generated 37 different projects. And that particular plan, I'm funding or trying to fund over 5 years to be able to complete all those 37 projects. The next one is I think it's just something that hasn't been done in the city, and I want to start as an annual sign and striping replacement. Some of our lane lines fade, and what we've been doing historically is we do a slurry or a street paving, and we come behind and replace the new stripes, but I want to be more proactive, so that's just a project that I want to start. And the last one on the list is pickleball courts.
Jill, where are we with the pickleball courts project?
So this year is the first year we're actually looking to fund it. So we haven't made any progress, and it's part of the discussion today, how it fits in the priorities.
So have we made a determination as to how many more pickleball courts we need and where we need them?
There has been a suggestion from the community of how many courts they would want to be. Actually, it was one of the submittals for the community-initiated project. So we have some of that information from the community. I think it does require more exploring, probably even with the Parks Master Plan, but that's where we're at right now.
Excuse me. I think we do need to step back and have a good conversation with those who are playing pickleball. What we have seen over the last many years is this is a recreation activity that's growing tremendously, most particularly growing tremendously with a demographic of older individuals that fits into an awful lot of the Palm Springs community. And I don't want to sacrifice any other recreation activities, but it's one of the ones that we do need. There are some examples of communities that have been very successful in building pickleball courts. One of the fundamental questions, though, that comes to me is, do we need to be of best service to those who want to play pickleball? A court here in this park, a court here in this park, a court somewhere else, or do what I understand a few leading communities have done, make a decision that this particular recreation activity is going to be concentrated at a center where everybody can come to play and take advantage of that. So I think we should engage with the community and get a good sense of what's needed and where are we today in comparison to what's needed, and then start to move forward.
So I might just suggest, similar to some of the conversation about library and others, if we can get a little bit clear on some of these, how they compare to one another in terms of priorities. Obviously, pickleball courts is on a totally different scale than a library or a fire station. But once we have that established, I think we would have conversations with council with virtually each one about what should the cycle of planning, design, and construction look like. Is it integrated with some other plan, like a Sunrise Park or a Parks Master Plan, or does that analysis exist on its own? So we would probably do that for almost anything on that scale.
And before I give it to Mayor Pro Tem Garner, obviously, this is the kind of view that we need to take of all of our recreation needs.
Thank you, Mayor. Yeah, that's actually what I was going to bring up. I know that pickleball is popular, and because it is popular among our retirees, we tend to hear from pickleball players more. But one thing that we still haven't done in so long, ever actually, is put up a soccer field or two, and every single weekend there are people who make the soccer fields themselves, and they've done it all of my 36 years, and I'm sure before that. So I think a soccer field is probably a lot easier than a larger pickleball facility, but those are some of the kinds of things that I think our parks could really use, and because we already know where they're putting the soccer fields every Saturday and Sunday, I don't think it would be as difficult, right? We don't have to map out where they would go. We would just put them where they are currently playing. So I'd like to see that. In terms of the list of the priorities, can we put the list back up on the screen? I don't have it. The library, I think, is the top of my list. It's been something we've been talking about for a long time and really need to move forward on it. I'd also like to see the road safety and the pedestrian safe routes to school, those plans implemented sooner than later. I think those are big priorities for us, as we've discussed. And then the fire station, getting that going, because I think that's going to take a lot of time. And so to be able to kind of start figuring out what exactly is needed, even if it's a very slow process, I think would be better to at least understand what that's going to take and what possible funding, like the mayor said, is going to be available. The other things I don't have as much strong feelings about, I suppose. I do think the Measure J community projects are higher up on the list, because I do appreciate the work that Measure J does in soliciting comments from the community, and that these are projects directly from our residents saying, you know, these are things that they would like. And some of these are items that we've already discussed in the past, like the Demuth Dog Park is on here. And I know the shade structures at several places, you know, those are things that we've already been starting the process of. So it would be nice to be able to do that. Some of the things that are on the Measure J list, though, I would need a little bit more information on, and hopefully Measure J could provide that to us. For instance, the gardens at local schools, of course, I want to support our local schools, but what is Palm Springs Unified's responsibility there, and how would we be collaborating with them, et cetera? So there's a lot of questions in terms of Measure J, but I do think it's important that we're spending some time to implement some of the things that the community is specifically asking for as well.
Questions and comments? Thank you.
I know you've
Councilman
asked
Woods.
a very specific question. Sorry, Mayor.
Yeah.
I know you've asked a very specific question of us, and I have a lot of other questions or concerns or whatever. Before I get there, and I don't know the appropriate time. You know, there's certain things that aren't in here, and you know, I'd like to see in there. And I'll give you an example. One that you have in there is traffic calming. $500,000 is not enough. We know that. You know, I know neighborhoods have been working for 9 years to get traffic calming and have not gotten it. Not enough money. Not to the degree that we are trying to put up speed cameras, not to the degree that people want our streets slower, not to the degree that we have the safe routes to school and some of the recommendations in that. There is no way that stuff is going to occur on $500,000. So I need staff to rethink that a little bit. And look at those documents and look at the cumulative amount of money, because it's way short. And I think that is a pressing need, as we just had a huge press release that one of the major concerns for people was speed on our streets. And one of the best ways we're going to do it is not through enforcement, but through geometric design changes to those streets. So I just want to point out that that is one issue that I'm a little bit concerned with. There is a lot of money for pickleball courts in this proposed budget. I don't know how we came up with that amount of money for it, but I've got two line items for $725,000, which is quite a bit of money. And I don't know how much a pickleball court cost, but I assume we're not acquiring land or anything. So I'm just curious where that number comes from, and that it's true. The Measure A in the documents that you sent is very confusing, because the page you just had us pull up to is like $1.6 million, right? But yet, when you look at the actual document, I think it's for Measure. That's for the community projects, right? And I thought they were supposed to give us $1 million. We're already half over that. Measure J. I'm sorry, what did I say? Measure J. So I'm concerned about Measure. You know, those numbers aren't lining up for me. And there's also when you look at the overall list that you gave us. The amount of expenditure seems to be under what the amount is for that we actually have to spend. So there's several different numbers that are very confusing to me. I'd like to, at least in the next meeting, to have out. I agree with Mayor Pro Tem. We need to look at some of those recommendations for community projects, because a lot were not approved. As an example, I think she just gave, the school district has its own responsibilities, as do some other facilities, and they're not necessarily a city responsibility, but yet we have city needs that are getting ignored in that recommendation. So I'm concerned about that we need to look at that. The other thing that we've talked about, you have the Amico track in there, and over 2.5 years ago, 2.5 years ago, when we first did this budget, I said there are other places without sewer that are in the same economic position, and that has never been put in the budget. I think that is a mistake. If we're going to do the Amica track, which I'm totally in support of, we got to look at the whole thing holistically with our sewer system in the city, and I think that's important to do. Again, I understand its phases, but this is a 5-year. If we don't have it in, it will never get done or ever be looked at. So I think that actually needs to be looked at. I was a little concerned about the Jackie Lee Houston Plaza. There's $100,000 worth of upgrades, including a shade structure. I know people have been asking for a shade structure at Victoria Park. Measure J's recommended one at the animal shelter. I don't know how many people use the Jackie Lee Houston Plaza for a shade structure, but they definitely need it at Victoria Park. So, if we need it at both places, great, let's budget it. If it's only needed at one place, let's go where there's demand and request. And we've had these requests for this type of stuff, so I would ask for that. We've asked for, some,
Convention center.
if I'm going too fast, let me know.
No, I would have to look at the video again. I can't take notes that fast,
Yeah,
but
just-
I'm listening generally.
I think
what
we
you're,
need to add that in, right? We just need to add that in. We've asked for a palm tree uplighting, especially in the north end where it's very dark and unsafe. I'd like to have that added in. I was a little unclear about the Tockwitz medians from El Cielo to Sunrise. We have a lot of problems with that current median. We spent a ton of money designing that median. Stacy's been working very hard to try and get it to work. It's still not working. Plants are missing, lights aren't working, half of them are on at night. So I don't know what that amount of money was for, and I'd just like some clarification, and we can do it offline. That's fine as well, just try to get.
If you can mention the project number, if you have that in front of you, it also will help us track with
I'm sorry, I didn't pull that number off. But you might be able to search, I can't search it on the
okay,
one I have.
no worries, no
Right.
worries.
Right,
Continue.
and so, I think, I support pickleball courts, but I have a little different opinion that, our facilities should be spread throughout the city. So, as an example, if I were to play pickleball, it's a 25-minute drive for me. That's not, if and people are doing that, that's not good for our environment. It's not good for vehicle miles traveled. That's driving a car. So I really think when we do this, we have to look holistically at our sustainability goals as well. Those facilities, if we expand them, need to be in more locations closer to people where they're at. And so I think that's important. And that's probably something, our parks and recs can look at in that whole thing. But I think it's something to be very mindful of when we look, if we're going to do an expenditure, that expenditure follow our sustainability goals as well. So thank you very much.
Other questions, comments? Mayor Pro Tem.
Just to be clear, these are the projects that we're discussing that are on this list are the 64 that you mentioned before, right? So even this other list, the shorter list that we were looking at, that's part of the 64?
What I was trying to describe with the 64, those are ongoing projects, and in our capital, we have those, most of those 64 projects.
Okay,
But
so
if they're
then-
fully funded, they're no longer in this next year's fiscal CIP.
Okay, so then the priorities that we were just talking about, the 9 items,
Those are in they're not part of this, they're included in the 64, but to distinguish, the 64 is what I wanted to, I guess, introduce the council to all the projects that are currently active. If they're fully funded, they start dropping off of the next year's 5-year CIP. So there's sort of a distinction there. This current CIP has 53 projects. The 9 priorities are part of the current CIP.
okay, I'm just wanting to make sure that I'm clear on where all of these projects came from and why something else wasn't included on the list. So these are all the 64 projects that we've discussed up until this point. right?
I believe so.
Yes.
Okay.
Sometimes, admittedly, projects arise out of a conversation like this one where we might not work really hard to reconcile the differences of opinions of 5 council members that collectively make a council. And so sometimes staff is reading between the lines and saying, we think we heard support for this, we think we heard support for that. Many of these could go back to previous council members that aren't here. And so the conversation we're having is both about, let's prioritize the things we think we know we're supposed to be pursuing, but it is open to things that shouldn't be in the CIP any longer that are, things that need to be added that aren't. At the end of the day, the hardest part is still going to be making this something realistic that we can pursue. And there's probably more work to lean it up and narrow focus than there is opportunity to add. But the easy thing to do is always to add. And that's mostly how this conversation is going so far.
Sure. Yeah, I understand that. I was just a little bit confused because there was, I think we have discussed so many different things, and that's part of the difficulty in figuring out what we have discussed and how this list came to be. Councilmember Holsted, did you want to add to that before I move on?
That's okay. Go ahead and finish, and then I saw Councilmember Kors, I think, before me, and then I'll go
Okay.
too.
You look like you wanted to say something. Just a couple of things that I didn't see listed that I know that we've talked about in the past, and I just want to raise. One is that we did talk about shade at the bus stops, and doing that, and ideally benches too. Some of those bus stops don't have benches either. I don't know. We've discussed it briefly. We have not gone into detail. We've not figured out if Sunline would be able to contribute or not. We do have the list that the mayor sent of all of the, go ahead.
Yeah, the city manager and I met with Sunline today, actually, and there was conversation about shade structures at bus stops, and let me see if I can find my notes, and Justin, please fill in if I missed it. But
Yeah, so what we looked at is, number one, they have a policy where they aim for shade at locations where they have 10 pickups or greater per day. That leaves, my recollection, about 27 that are under that threshold across the entire system, and they're targeting about 9 that currently don't have shade but meet that threshold. They did invite a broader partnership to look at opportunities to create shade, maybe not quite the robust structures that we see, but more limited for some of those stops that just currently see lower activity. But it looked like grand total, maybe 30 or so that don't have it.
I'm not going to stand at a bus stop if there's no shade in Palm Springs. I think it's a chicken egg kind of issue.
well, one of the questions that we did ask them is to identify how many boardings there is at each one of them so that we could get a better sense as to if 10 is your standard, are we dealing with locations where there's 7 or 8, or are we dealing with 0, 1, and 2? Mm-hmm. And but where it is 10 or where it is less than 10, clearly that's going to not qualify under their standards. So if there's going to be a funding decision, is one we're going to need to make, and we'll probably want to take and develop our own criteria as to what would be the most appropriate places to do those. And I think all of us would hope it was all of them, but that may not be the case.
Okay, thank you. And then that's helpful to know that there's going to be some work by Sunline already on this. Then just the other piece that we haven't talked about in a long time, and I don't know if it should have gone into the last discussion or not, but that's the Buzz Bus. We stopped the Buzz because of COVID, and we haven't discussed it again. We had in the past discussed expanding the line so that it would go further and really connect our residents and not just our tourists. And then it seems to have just disappeared. And so I'm just curious what we can do about that, because that is one of the major complaints that we get with Sunline, and is that there's not enough bus routes, there's not enough, the timing of the bus is just, it's 45 minutes generally between buses. And I understand Sunline has other measures that they're using as well for why there's not buses more often, but the buzz was kind of a way to help with that here in Palm Springs. So I just wanted to put that out there because it's something that I feel like has been missing from a lot of our conversations recently.
If I could on the buzz, there's a long history with that, and I believe it may have been before you came on council, but we had quite a bit of debate as to the buzz, and were successful actually in bringing a pilot program to bring it back. There was support from Sunline in that, and Sunline bought all of the buses that were used for the buzz at their cost, not at ours. And ultimately, the ridership was just such that council made a decision not to continue to fund it, and that was really our decision on council not to continue to fund the buzz. And it wasn't one of my happy days when we had to make that decision, but I think they still own the buses. They're still there, and there has been some various ideas as to how to use them, none that have actually surfaced into proposals. One of the conversations most recently has been that for the new arena, those old buses may be an appropriate way to transport people throughout the valley to the arena, but I think that's really just conversation. But I'd be very happy to engage that conversation all over again. But the cost that we were looking at per rider was extraordinarily high. Councilmember Holsted, you've been waiting patiently.
Sorry, impatiently. Okay, trying to figure out where to begin. Thank you for this information. I think it was really helpful and a really thorough way to really look at what are all the existing projects. And I don't think that that's information that council's been presented with in this level of detail and, this thorough way. So I really appreciate that information. And I think that's sometimes why council, other than, we work for the public and the public is constantly asking us for a library and pickleball courts and water parks and, everything. And we work for them, but, we don't always see this information when we're bringing on new things. So I think that was a helpful discussion. I'm a little confused about what is the policy direction that the city council is supposed to give right now. And it seems like some of the lead was buried here for the public about what actually the capital improvement staff is recommending in this budget. And I'm just having a really hard time personally following that. And what is it, the policy direction that you want from us? So I see that you've listed all the existing projects, and then you've listed the projects for prioritization in the staff report. Though they don't have amounts on them. So then we need to look at the whole document to compare that and understand. So could you just lay out in really simple terms for the public? Because if I'm this confused about what we're supposed to be doing here, I see Councilmember Coors in my Zoom room is nodding along too, that we're confused about exactly what decisions we should make. And I would love to know the process that got us here, because this is a different process that we've used than before. So typically, Measure J would make recommendations and staff would make recommendations to Measure J, and then they would bring that forward. And so we would then, the council would look at that, and we might look at past lists of staff recommended projects, and we look at past lists of Measure J recommended projects, and we would pick from those with a lot of information about the projects. So this seems different, in terms of the overall projects. And I think what Mayor Pro Tem Garner said before is that it's not thorough, it's not complete. There's a lot here that council's discussed that just isn't on this list. There are other things staff's recommended in the past that we didn't fund in the last Measure J cycle. There's things from that measure, the last few Measure J cycles that I don't see on this. So I'm just, sorry, I'm a big picture person, and this is very, very in the weeds about certain topics. And I just want to know what's my big picture governance role here in strategically prioritizing funds for the most important capital development projects. Does that make sense?
Let me see if I can help. First, I'm just going to say something about the way we got here. A lot of these projects came by way of independent initiative, right? One day there was a program through Caltrans to submit for Cycle 7 or Cycle 8, and we did. Some of those decisions were made in 2016 or 17 or 18, so it's easy to lose sight of those things.
Sorry, I just mean the 2022 ones. I didn't mean to bring up the entire packet. So I just mean the new ones. Obviously, I know that there are older ones that have been on the list for a long time.
So that's kind of what created the list. The CIP is an attempt to consolidate all that. Again, I'm acknowledging, especially since I wasn't here, that there may have been instances where staff was reading between the lines or trying to pick up cues from council. Big picture, what we're trying to do is reconcile this plan and make sure it reflects your priorities and interests with a focus on next year. Because frankly, years 2 through 5, we have, lots of opportunities to get that right. We do, at some point, want a 5-year CIP where every year there are projects that are important and that there are no projects that are forgotten. But for now, we at least want to prioritize next year. So if there are projects that we're pursuing, even the 64 that we've started, if we shouldn't be pursuing them, we should have that conversation. If there are things that should be on the list that aren't, we should have that conversation. Keep in mind, it's all within the context of this plan already being kind of overwhelmingly large. So at some point, we still have to do the hard job of what is most important and what is least. But that's the policy direction we're looking for, is does this plan reflect your priorities? I don't think staff made almost any of this up. This came from at least bits and pieces of conversation with council over the years, but that doesn't mean that we've gotten exactly right in terms of being reflective of your most important needs and priorities.
I think, Justin, if you could maybe clarify the Measure J portion as well, because I know Councilmember Holster was focusing on or asking about Measure J and what that process was and why is it a little bit different and what happened during the pandemic. And if you could kind of sort that out, maybe it brings it a little bit closer to understand.
Sure. So obviously Measure J, like a lot of things, was paused during the pandemic. During that pause, the city also conceived of or planned to do this 5-year CIP. So what happened, at least in this last cycle, and I understand before the pandemic, there was a joint meeting where Measure J would say, this is what we think we ought to do. Council would weigh in on that, and we'd come up with a list. But those are just projects where Measure J contributes funding. What you see here is a lot of projects that receive no Measure J funding at all. So again, part of what makes this overwhelming is we've consolidated in one place the projects that Measure J contributes to with all of the other projects that are still capital, but where Measure J doesn't. So what staff did last May is presented Measure J with a list of projects saying, in light of this CIP, we think these are projects where Measure J funding would be appropriate. They were discussed. I think there was general support expressed for the projects, but we fell short of doing what we had done before the pandemic, which is having this joint meeting as the primary way to kind of compare notes with council and make final recommendations. I think because staff was proposing something new with the CIP, that staff felt like we got the input we needed for Measure J, and then we learned that Measure J didn't feel the same way. So that all still begs the question how we kind of reconcile that moving forward. We are going to get Measure J's recommendations and bring those to you. So we'll have that part. If you would like to have the joint meeting as a way of comparing notes, we can do that as well, just recognizing we have competing demands for council time. We've added study sessions and done other things, but we still have lots of work that we're not getting to.
Thank you, that's helpful. So, okay, I'm looking here on page, it's 5 out of 127. It's not marked in the document that I have, but I guess page 5 of the capital improvement program. So that says Fund 260 Measure J. So that shows the current, existing projects and then the 2022 proposed projects, right? So yeah, the 2019 ones are the ones I recognize that I think last approved, right? And then can you remind me, so the projects that were impacted by the pandemic from Measure J in 2020 and 2021, we put most of those on pause, right? On hold.
So I compiled the list, basically the CIP list, and to do the CIP list correctly and to project, I combined all the funds. So the ones that you are looking at, the 22, the new projects, we still haven't really taken to Measure J. So I included them there. I was gonna have to undo a lot of work to be able to give you a CIP that didn't have Measure J funded projects in there. So we called it a draft, but here we're clarifying with council. We are going back to Measure J. I think a meeting scheduled for the 11th, which is next week, where we will present these projects. And when we bring you the final copy, if Measure J at some point resolves that they don't support these projects, they will be removed and they will not be brought forward. But it would be a list that Measure J approves, if that sort of explains.
So yeah, just really quick. So I think that's what had confused me, is that these are not approved by city council. They're being requested to be approved now through the budget process and the approval of the CIP. Is that right?
And to clarify, we would also propose that these go to Measure J first, and they may agree with some of this and they may change some of those recommendations. So it would go to Measure J and then come back in some revised form. And that would simply be to decide where the Measure J funding goes. That doesn't preclude a new project from coming onto the list. But for the most part, the CIP is a pretty good collection of projects. You can add to it for sure, but it's pretty substantial as it is. So all that's left to clarify, I think, is which ones Measure J funding will support. Again, with the caveat that some projects could be added or removed entirely.
Do you have a follow-up question, Councilor?
Yeah, just follow up on that, because I might have misheard this, but because the process is, right, Measure J will make recommendations. Usually they're prioritized, at least in the past, if Measure J funds are being used. But if they don't recommend it, it shouldn't come off the list. It should just, if it's a staff recommendation to use Measure J funds, because ultimately they make recommendations, but we'll decide. So I thought it was just said that they'd come off the list if Measure J doesn't recommend them, but they would just come to us without a recommendation, right? The recommendation is not to do that right now.
That's right. So sorry if that wasn't clear. All I mean to say is right now, it would appear as though Measure J has already suggested these are the priorities. We would bring you a revised list that Measure J blesses that says these are our priorities from the perspective of Measure J. That does not preclude staff from having different recommendations, or it doesn't preclude council from making different decisions. But we thought these projects had been vetted by Measure J. And again, I think most of them were discussed, but we just fell short of getting the vote of approval, so to speak.
Right. And a couple things. One, I do think what we've done in the past is we sort of started with a joint meeting or almost study session hour with Measure J, so we could ask them questions. So, I mean, there was some question raised about like a school garden project. So what their thinking was, and there are things we'll know that they may not know about agreements we have with some of, with leases that may put funding things in place. Just looking at some of the community projects. But is one of the things you want from us on these 9 projects to prioritize, I guess my question is, 1, do we have the funding to do all of them? And 2, do we have, if yes, do we have the staff? Because otherwise it's really hard to prioritize, right? Or you're saying pick this much money's worth to do these? I don't feel I have enough information, I guess, to have a sense of what I'm supposed to be doing on this thing. The 64 projects were great. I've never seen that before. It's so helpful for us in the public, so I really appreciate that. I'm just not sure what exactly we're doing with this list of 9 things that all would be great to do.
And if I can clarify too, just to retain my time.
Go ahead, Councilmember Halsted.
So I don't lose the train of thought. Thank you. That's what we're used to, is a lot more information and community vetting and public process before these projects come to us. And so, immediately, if we approve this for pickleball, which I support, we're going to get immediate questions about why not this? Why not this? What about this? You also promised this, right? And I just don't, usually what we have is a list of projects Measure J recommended. We have the list of projects staff recommended to Measure J to recommend to consider. And then we have even sometimes council initiated projects for Measure J. And then what we have, and when we don't get it, I always ask in the last 4 years, is detailed descriptions of those projects. So I appreciate that information is in the CIP, but it's not super accessible to the public in the staff report, or even to me looking at it now and trying to pull up this document that's online and is hard to load. So, while I'm doing it. So could you, City Manager, I know you're going to respond to that, but just for clarity, that's the process that we typically have. And we understand that we want to streamline those processes and make sure they're clear about roles, but we are used to this being a lot more baked before it comes to us, and this just seems pretty preliminary.
So Council, we can certainly take any direction you'd like in vetting the Measure J projects especially. We do acknowledge that we want to go back to them and get their recommendations, and that those recommendations need to come back to you. And what you'd like to do is what we did before the pandemic and have a study session to compare notes with them. That's fine. In some ways, I can understand what you're saying, that some of this is less thorough with something like the Measure J that right now is more conceptual. At the same time, we're looking at a consolidated document. The Measure J funding has historically been, 15, 17 million. It's exceeding maybe 20 million, but we've got $333 million in projects. So we're trying to expand the context as well, and it's hard to both expand the breadth of the projects, but then also include that depth. So you're absolutely right. If there are things on here that you want to flag as not ready for decision-making, that's input that we can take now. We're not trying to be too presumptuous, but with certain things like the library, we have figured, since it's been discussed in earnest by city councils for almost a decade, that is still something that we need to resolve, right? So, and we've also talked about things like fire stations. So if we are looking for any prioritization on that list, and not excluding that you want to introduce brand new things, and we've heard some of that come up this evening, our goal is to demonstrate, one, we've got a lot of projects already going, but two, what are those that we should start the earlier stages of planning to lead into design, to lead into construction? What are the next ones? We issued a list of 9 projects based on things that we either previous councils have said, or we've learned elsewhere, sound like priorities, but that does not mean it's an exclusive list. So if you don't want to do any of those projects and want to do others, that's fine. That is the direction we're looking for. I understand that Measure J typically brings its recommendations. If you want to pause this conversation until we have a conversation with Measure J and bring that back, we can. This is a little bit of a lofty, expectation to have you grapple with this entire CIP. And because we have so many projects going, we are not going to be sitting around tomorrow with nothing to do, wondering what projects are priorities. So we do have time.
If I could try to bring the conversation together a bit. The 5-year capital improvement program seems to me a very systematic approach to trying to identify what funds and what our spending plans are going to be for capital projects over the next 5 years. But in my time on council, this is not the approach to which we've dealt with these kinds of projects and approvals in the past. This may well be an improvement, and I think it probably is over what we've done previously, but we've got to get our hands and heads around approaching this process. It strikes me that the fundamental decision that we need to make between now and the end of this fiscal year is what is going to be our capital improvement budget for 2022-23, and that's that question of what's that budget and what are those projects seems to me to be the most critical questions that we have to answer in the next 2 months.
Thank you, Mayor. I think that's a good way to take a smaller bite of the apple. And because we have a lot of projects already started, and because we have a lot of restricted revenues, the funds aren't going anywhere. We have a defined beginning balance, and we have a pretty well-known, incoming revenue and estimate to year end. So the starting point is the same regardless of what we want to do with projects. Maybe what we do for purposes of the budget is retain some of those dollar amounts and start to take on smaller bites of the apple. For instance, we've presented 64 active projects. Maybe we ought to have some focus on those since they're already in some stage of being planned or constructed, and make sure that we're not taking on anything that's a low priority. Maybe after that, we circle back with Measure J and some of those specific projects. And maybe after we get an entire year's worth of new priorities, we start to take on years 2, 3, 4, and 5 in the CIP to make sure our master list is reflective of all of these interests and the things that may have been forgotten about over the years. We can take it in phases. We don't have to resolve all of that as part of the budget approval because the funding is there. No matter what, not going anywhere, and we're very busy with projects. So we can take this in pieces if that helps.
It would help me, but I want to know, I need to know whether or not that's the direction all of us would like to go. So that would prioritize what are the decisions that we need to make for the next fiscal year and those decisions that must be made over the course of the next 2 months.
Yes, and I would just ask, since we have presented the 64 projects, if we were limiting our analysis now and our focus to those, if you heard any that struck you as things we shouldn't be doing, or if we need to kind of revisit those when we break this into pieces.
I think it'd be really hard for all of us to come to consensus on we shouldn't do this or we shouldn't do that. We may all pick a project out of the 125 pages and say, I'm not sure we should do this, but to get to the point that we have consensus, I think would be a struggle right now. That's one person's opinion, but
So Council, I think that could just be our path forward then, is again, the budget amounts themselves, they can be allocated in consolidated line items where, or we can allocate them even kind of somewhat prospectively to the projects, especially the ones that are already started and active, so that we can continue to expense on those projects. But maybe next time we revisit this, we'll take a component piece. I would recommend, just from initial thought, that first we look at the projects that we are in some sort of active stage of pursuing, because the priority there is if there's something we shouldn't be doing, we need to make that decision right away, right? Before we enter a contract for design or something else. And then I think we'll have a separate follow-up conversation on Measure J recommendations. And that will probably give us more than enough for the next 12 to 24 months, which gives us time to revisit some of the remaining pieces of the CIP that are more future-looking to make sure that it captures our entire inventory. There may be a little reconciliation through Measure J about, individual projects that each council member is interested in, but we can take that as it comes. It doesn't have to happen before budget approval.
Does that work for everyone?
I don't know if I'm completely understanding.
Yeah, I'm confused. I'm not I think I agree with part of that and not the other part. So I agree with breaking it into incremental chunks. But I do think that capital project expenditures and allocations are really important for us to approve in the budget. And I definitely want a say in that now. So can you explain the recommendation further?
Yes, Council, we have some restricted sources of funding that only go to capital. They're not going anywhere. The way that you typically weigh in on what's allocated is deciding what projects those funds support. The funding itself for most of those are already dedicated to capital, like Measure J. It's not going to be spent on anything else, so the money doesn't go away. So you don't weigh in on what's coming in on Measure J next year, right? That's a revenue projection. And whatever comes in is just reflective of spending in the community. It's not a decision we have to make. The decision is, where do we spend those funds? And so that's the part that's going to wait. We can forecast 27 million coming in from Measure J today and decide after the budget is approved what projects receive funding. Does that help?
Yeah, so I disagree with that plan. I think we should have those conversations for this fiscal year in the budget. I think it's really important. That's one of the ways that the community has their input through us in allocating what projects are going to come forward. And we've been fighting for a lot of years to, for example, set aside money for the library and get this fire station one, ready to go. So I want to see action. I understand that I'm hearing that staff is overwhelmed by the current projects, and, we can plan that out in the way that it is in the CIP, but I'm not comfortable deferring this. And I think I can prioritize among the top 9 with more information and recommendation from Measure J and just more detailed cost information in a staff report.
If I could ask Councilmember Halsted, my understanding is that we would be addressing all of the issues that you're referencing, but we would concentrate over the course of the next 2 months on those decisions that have to be made before the start of the next fiscal year. So it's not taking, at least as I understand it, we're not taking any decision away from City Council. We're just timing them in such a way as to deal with those things that we have to decide now.
If
Councilmember Coors.
Go ahead, Justin.
So I'm only recognizing that it's May 4th. We have to pass a budget before the end of June. Measure J is going to take a look at recommendations on the 11th. If they're done with those and we have a place on our agenda for an additional study session or something, we can absolutely bring those back. I'm only making the point that while we want to get as much of this clear for the upcoming budget as possible, July 1 is not a magic date, right? So let's get as much work done as we can before the start of the fiscal year. But if you made the decision on how to allocate Measure J on July 10th, because what was in the budget was a placeholder, we'd replace that placeholder with specific projects on July 10th. So we will work as hard as we can to get as far down that road as possible. It's difficult to anticipate with the number of questions and other things that have come up how much progress we'll make, but we will work at it.
Thank you.
Councilmember Coors.
Yeah, I mean, if we're talking about July to make some of these decisions, and it gives us more opportunity to meet with Measure J and the public to weigh in, I'm okay with that, but where I'm a little challenged is there were some infrastructure projects we talked about from the general fund. So if we end up with, let's say, 4 of these priorities, right, out of Measure J funds, then we have to decide if there are other one-time spending, right, that came about at our last study session, like the Plaza Theater came up, just as an example. So that's where separating them is a little more challenging. And so Justin, can you address that, or how you think we would do that?
Sure. So the only thing standard and typical that comes from the general fund is a $2 million transfer from the general fund to the capital fund. You're right that I suggested potentially using some of the accumulated fund balance in the general fund strictly for the Plaza Theater. And actually, I think the proposal was some that might come from Measure J and some that might come from that fund balance. I believe that's virtually the only exception. There are some investments we make out of the general fund and fleet and facilities and things that are capital assets, but for the most part, all of the big capital projects are housed in the general fund, and the capital fund, don't mean to make this worse. All of our big projects are housed in the capital fund, and the only thing that comes from the general fund to support them is the $2 million transfer. Everything else is pretty much a source of revenue that goes into the general fund already, like Measure J.
So if, for example, all right, we decide some of these will be coming out of capital fund or Measure J, and then there are one-time other things council wants to use fund balance for example, that are infrastructure, would we do that in July as well and just use fund balance once we've decided on these other projects?
I don't think you're going to have a lot of time pressure to do that because we have accumulated balances already in our capital fund. You're not going to expense the available funding in 12 months no matter what we do. So you might still decide well before we execute the project that you would prefer it to come from existing general fund balance instead of our accumulated capital fund balance. But you would even have time to make that decision well before we're spending the money. Because we have, I don't know if we have any schedule or if Nancy or anyone can help us understand what our fund balance is in the general fund or some of the unspent from sources like Measure J. But because we're a little bit behind and coming off the pandemic, we have significant funding there.
Yeah.
So the issue really won't be missing the opportunity to make a decision to support those with general fund dollars.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you.
Councilmember Halstage, does that help you?
Can I ask a follow-up? I'm so sorry. So I don't know if it's
No.
my baby was up at 5 a.m. or if I'm just not understanding, because for me, this is a trade-off, like I said, between allocated positions and capital. And so the city has additional revenue that we could invest in the community, and we can do it for one, for both, for all, or for some. So I'm not understanding when I have to make the decision in approving the budget, do we need 15 firefighters? Or do we need to do a capital improvement dollars for Station 1? How do I make those decisions about budget allocations for staffing and on the side that you presented last time without approving this? To me,
Right.
those are all combined. And so I'm having a really hard time because they're not separating out. I mean, we have enough excess revenue essentially to, really kickstart a library right away. Do we have the staffing capacity? Maybe not, right? Do we have the planning that's required? Not yet. But to me, those are all different sides of the same coin of how we spend our money and deploy it and invest it in the community. So how could I approve a budget without being able to weigh those things together?
Yes. Nancy Pauley here to talk to you. So what we're talking about, our last study session, we brought just the general fund forward. We're bringing the capital project fund separately because it really doesn't relate to the general fund. The only thing that relates to the general fund, which is operational to run the city, is most of the salaries. There aren't any really salaries paid out of the capital projects. So when you want to know the difference between, say, do we fund 15 firefighters or do we build a pickleball court? You're talking about two separate things. The firefighters would come directly from the general fund, which is not affected with the CIP. So the CIP funds don't have salaries, and it's not determined of what our operations are in the general fund. So when we have our capital projects fund, the money we get in there, it's this whole different fund, and we record the revenues and expenditures just for projects. Those monies coming in are specifically for projects. So it won't affect the general fund at all unless the capital project, for some reason, didn't have enough funding for a specific project, and then you might want to subsidize that project by using general fund dollars. At this point, our capital projects funds have more than enough money to cover projects for the next 10 years because of how many we have and how long it's taking to get these projects completed. Does that make a little more sense, Chrissy?
So thank you. I think that was a really helpful explanation for the public who might not understand how this works. I appreciate and understand how the different funds work, but if we could add additional money from the general fund to the capital fund if we wanted to do additional projects, or we could fund projects out of the general fund too to pay for a library or something of that sort. So we can move money between, and so really it's not all that separated in the way that you're describing when we approve the budget. And if I'm the only one here, I know it's late, I'm happy to discuss it with staff, as we go, if council has different direction. But to me, the money that we deploy to the community and how much we invest in capital improvement and planning and how much we might put aside for different projects is related to how much staffing we add. I mean, there are huge requests to increase staffing with our budget that was proposed for the general fund.
Yes, I think you're absolutely right on that piece of the relationship. If council's priority was completing more projects, then it may require additional support from the general fund. I think that is the point you're making, and I think that's a good point. I think Nancy is right that there is no sea change in our approach that's going to spend down our capital funds that quickly. If you want to exercise more restraint because you think the future of our capital fund might need more support than the $2 million we've been putting in and the money that comes in from Measure J, that really is a significant difference in approach that would take a broader conversation. And if council thinks that might be the case, then yes, we should have that conversation soon so that you can exercise that restraint in new positions to the general fund. Generally speaking, we take our general fund for ongoing revenues and ongoing costs, but you're absolutely right. The amount that supports the capital fund has bearing on the whole equation.
And it's so unique this year because we have so much additional in revenue than that was budgeted. And so it is one of our first and only opportunities to have a significant money available to really decide how much should go to staffing, how much should go to capital. If we have all this deferred maintenance. We have all this deferred projects, right? I mean, if we can't deploy it now, we could at least set it aside, like we can promise the community a library, right? And I saw you have a plan in there, but we could do more. And so for me, I'm on that side of how do we use this as an opportunity, and I'm just not understanding the bifurcation of those two things because I think they're one and the same for me.
Mayor Pro Tem Garner.
Thank you. I think it was helpful to get a sense of both sets of funds, but I agree with Councilmember Holstage that the next step is really looking at it together and figuring out how we want to move forward. Because the general fund is flexible and we can decide to put more money towards different things. I mean, it's like with the engineering, I mean, it's very clear that our engineering team is doing a lot, and I know that we are proposing that we're adding to the engineering team, but perhaps we want to add more. And that's the kind of thing that I was thinking about as I was hearing this presentation. So I think being able to really look at both of these documents and this materials together and see where there might be gaps or where there might be opportunities for more efficiencies or whatever it is, I think that would be helpful. And especially like the fire station, we don't have enough capital funds for the entire fire station right now. So maybe we want to add more money towards that right now, knowing that it's a big upcoming project and we have additional funds now. So but to me, this is the next step, right? The next study session on the budget, or if that's the way we're going to go, would just be melding these items together so that we could get a fuller conversation and see how things connect.
Yeah, this is very helpful. I think we can bring them back and connect them and help illuminate some of what we're saying too about, we have an accumulated balance and we have incoming revenue. All the positions we have funded in total are something like $3 million, which is a drop for the capital fund. It's not a library. You could use our entire fund balance on a library and a fire station, but those monies are gone. And that's why the general fund is usually leaned on for ongoing operations, because you can do something like 20 positions, but that might only equal a small piece of a project. So maybe what we need to do is highlight some of those numbers and put some scale to this to just help create that context and ask the question where council would like to shift funding.
I think that would be helpful, and based on the emails that we're getting from the public as well, there's a lot of confusion. So I think it would just be helpful.
So it would seem that the next step will be a meeting in which we will be talking about the general fund. And
We'll propose talking about both so that we can make this linkage a little more clear and get a little more clear on our total balance in capital, our balance in our general fund, and then the incoming revenue for each, since they really function differently. And we'll include in that some analysis that would help you understand what it might look like to shift emphasis and that use the general fund to support projects, so that you can put that in context and give us direction.
so I just want to say that to my colleagues, I think we need to be careful regarding what are the decisions that we need to make and must make before June 30, and what are the decisions that we must make, but we do not have to make them before June 30. If I could, and I'm really almost don't want to do this because I don't want to prolong things too much, but I have some history with the the community-initiated projects from Measure J. I was, as a member of the community, one of the folks who argued very strongly that we needed to have them. The reason that they emerged as community-initiated projects is staff was bringing to Measure J, no offense intended, we think you should consider doing X, Y, and Z, and what was getting lost were the smaller community projects that many of us were interested in, and many of us pushed for to get Measure J passed. Measure J Commission became responsible through the request of the community and the direction of the City Council to develop these community-initiated projects. I understand what's happened in the last 2 years, but I believe it's very important that we give Measure J the opportunity to return to gaining community input as to what are the projects that they are most interested in for that $1 million, and that as much as possible, we as a council and as staff stay out of the process of the community engaging with Measure J until after Measure J has made their recommendations, and then that should come to City Council for a conversation. It is ultimately our final decision as to what will be approved or not approved. But that process of beginning the engagement with the community is something that, well, we got a lot of stop signs and some other really good projects that would have never made it to the top of the list had it not been for the community coming forward. Councilmember Woods.
Just when we come back with the, both the capital improvement and the general fund budget, I just really want to revisit a little bit, make sure what we're putting in for reserves and for our CalPERS, so we have a good understanding of that. I think that is a big liability for us, and I want to make sure that we're addressing it and not just addressing it for the future health of the city. So I just want to make sure that is part of the equation. I'm also going to ask to have a meeting with the city attorney on the Measure J process. I read the ordinance a little bit different. I know that there's been a process by which the city has morphed into. I think an oversight committee is very different than somebody who's making recommendations that they oversee. I think they should be making recommendations on their findings of the oversight, not on projects. So the city clerk has actually developed, done a public records request and developed a bunch of stuff. I'd like the city attorney to look at that, and then him and I can sit down and talk that through, because the process is just kind of going forward without kind of, let's look at it and make sure that it's all copacetic. Thank you.
Councilmember Kors.
Or just want to follow up on that. I think that's a whole council conversation. There's an ordinance that was passed back in 2011, I believe, when Measure J, when it was promised to the voters, there would be the commission to make recommendations. And it's very clear that they uses the word shall. The commission shall review all expenditures and shall make recommendations to the city council on all programs and projects proposed to be funded in whole or in part by Measure J revenues and priorities. So I think if we want to change the ordinance, that's absolutely our prerogative. But currently, that's what the ordinance requires, is that they're required to make recommendations to us before we make our decisions on Measure J, if it's any of the funds are used for Measure J. And I have the ordinance up right now. So if we want to change the ordinance, that's a conversation, change the ordinance and what the commission's roles and responsibilities are, we can definitely discuss that. But from the beginning, it talks about the Oversight Commission shall review all revenues and recommended expenditures and shall make recommendations to the city council if any Measure J funds are used. Now, we don't always follow them. I don't think there's a year we've ever, they've had different views and staff on some things, and council ended up doing something in between. But I think if we want to talk about changing the ordinance, that should be the whole council having that conversation.
Any other questions or comments? Justin, do you have the direction you need for this evening?
Yes, but I do think based on the number of things that are still not quite clear and in motion, that we ought to have an additional study session rather than trying to tackle some of this in the course of regular business on regular meetings. So I think we've done some work to identify potential dates. I don't know if we're 100% clear on when everybody can attend, but we're going to work on getting that scheduled right away.
Very good. So if there are no objections, we will at 8:50 stand adjourned. We will reconvene for a regular city council meeting on May 12th at 5:30 p.m. Thank you, everyone, and please be safe out there.